Aline seemed terribly shocked by the request for a map for a moment, but then her features returned to normal before she replied. I suppose that would be possible, but it would be costly to have a scribe pen a map of the city. That by itself will likely be a small gold and a few small silvers. I might mention that my fee for my services will be a small gold per title. I could also arrange to have any building cleaned up for no more than a couple large silver. After rattling off her prices, she just sat smiling like she expected him to refute her or something. After quickly doing the math in his head, Ryuji pulled out his leather pouch and rummaged through it. At first, he thought that he didn't have enough money to cover it without another trip to the money changer. He was about to close his pouch when he noticed an anomaly among the coins. One of the gold coins was a little thicker and just a bit wider. It was a large gold coin mixed in with the rest. He scolded himself for not checking his money sooner, then pulled that one out first and set it aside. He then produced 6 small gold and 6 large silver. The woman looked a tad surprised, but only mildly. Ryuji separated the coins into stacks and slid them over as he spoke. I would like to purchase the bakery and have it cleaned up as you offered. Your fee for the proceedings is here, and this is for the scribe's fee for the map. Remembering, he quickly pulled out another large silver. I almost forgot, your fee for getting the list of properties for sale and arranging for the scribe. I guess I wouldn't mind having the residences listed on it also, if this will cover that too. The woman smiled charmingly at him and thanked him for his business, telling him that his title would be ready the next day and the map she said she could have ready the day after. Ryuji told her that he would just come by and get them both at once. He went back to the magic shop with a big smile on his face. It faded quickly when he remembered the dreary task of translating that he had ahead of him that evening. When he finally finished the 4th page that he had set about reading, his head was throbbing, but he was definitely getting faster. He looked up from the book at the window. It was only just starting to get darker, but he had toiled to the breaking point to get the pages down. It turned out to be an account of the life and times of one of this world's great wizards. He was kind of getting into it, but the translation process was still arduous. It was only his 2nd day working on it though, so he figured he was doing pretty well. He called to Doran that he was leaving a tad early and headed for the plaza. Thinking about it, he actually had to pass by 2 other market plazas to get to the one he always shopped at, but he had no intention of changing that right now. He had spoken to Doran about it briefly, but apparently, the wares from the plaza he frequented were a bit higher quality due to the plaza being so near the Southern Nobles district. He was told that if a store was likely to succeed in getting into a storefront, that was the most likely place it would come from. It went perfectly with his plans. He chuckled to himself as he ran over the bridge spanning the river and into the southern part of the city. The ever-familiar sight of the Mercenaries' Guild brought him a smile as he passed it. Ryuji was astounded to find out from Karen that the guild building was the largest and oldest building in all of Lyril. It was a solitary fort before there was a city here. The city apparently grew around it. 3 buildings after the imposing Mercenaries' Guild and he reached the back entrance to the plaza he was after. The plaza was surrounded on all 3 sides by buildings, but it was still plenty light out. He headed straight to the bakery stall of Lisbeth. She looked like she had bad news, so he let her speak first after a brief greeting. Good evening, young lady, how does the day find you? Oh, a good evening, is it? Well, I don't know about that, young'un. My younger daughter found the perfect place for sale, but then she got moved aside by some guys going in to clean it out. Place even used to be a bakery, she says, but we were just a little too late. Somebody already bought it. Guess we'll just have to keep looking. Why are you grinning, young'un? Ryuji was trying hard to keep from bursting with laughter as he responded. That's terrible news. Or at least it would be. If I weren't the one who bought it, that is. The puzzled look on Lisbeth's face turned to one of astonishment. Then she got the biggest grin on her face. Well, you're just full of surprises, ain't ya? And to think how depressed my girl was. This ought to cheer her right up. I can't wait to go tell her. Well, the tax office isn't very far off. I'll go see if the key is available. Now, we definitely don't want to get in the way of the cleaning crew, but I'm sure they wouldn't mind us looking around a bit. I'll be right back. With that, Ryuji went over to the tax office. The building or house of the tax collector was only one street over, right at the edge of the nobles' district. The outside of the building was the same drab stones that looked melted together as the others around it, but the building was a bit large and was 3 stories tall. Its only really distinguishing feature was the gaudy blue and red doors and shutters. Ryuji walked up the steps and knocked. From the other side of the door, he heard a bit of ruckus, and shortly a familiar woman's voice called out for him to enter. As he stepped inside, he noticed the man and woman from earlier, but there was an unfamiliar pair also in the parlor. The new pair consisted of an older man and a young boy. As he stepped inside and his eyes adjusted to the low lighting, he realized that the one he took for a boy was actually another sun elf like himself. As he made eye contact, the other seemed to flinch slightly, then shook his head as if he had seen a ghost. The woman almost jumped to her feet upon seeing him. "Oh, what great timing, my lord. Let me introduce you to the scribe and cartographer, the esteemed Ceres Windy River. Sir Ceres was kind enough to rush over and begin immediately on the map you ordered. So, what brings you back so soon?" With a slight bow to both, Ryuji turned back to the lady tax collector, whom he only then realized he had never introduced himself to. "I spoke with my business associate and told her I would ask if the key to the building were available. She's so excited to be moving into a proper storefront that she's practically bouncing. Also, I fear I was terribly rude earlier. I never introduced myself. I was in such a rush to get things underway that I was rude to you. You have my humble apologies." After another deeper bow, he went on. "My name is Ryuji, and you are?" She tittered behind her hand in a show of false modesty before replying. "Oh, stop. I already told you that I'm no noble. My name is Aline Trust. My great-grandfather was the first trust in the history of this city, and our family has enjoyed the benefits since. That's the only reason I have the position of tax collector, so you really needn't treat me as if I were one of the nobility." Ryuji didn't want to seem ignorant, but he had no idea what a trust referred to. He guessed that it just meant a person that the nobility trusted. Thankfully, Aline went on without noticing the confusion on his face. "Now as to the key. I'm afraid I only had a pair to the property, and I entrusted both to the cleaners. They will most likely be working well into the night for the next 8 days to fix up everything. You can just go by there and have a look if you like. I'll pen you a note to hand to them so they know that you're the new owner." The sun elf, Ceres, was staring hard and it made Ryuji nervous, so he took the note and bowed to them all again before hurrying out of the office. He made his way back over to Lisbeth and told her what Ms. Trust had said and showed her the note. Lisbeth was so excited to go see the store that she gave Ryuji the rest of the baked goods to take by the sleeping tree inn before they made their way to the new storefront. When she heard the news, Teresa was shocked. "You say he bought you a bakery?" She turned a stunned look on Ryuji. "You bought it? Like, you own the bakery now?" Ryuji shrugged. "What can I say, I really like her bread and thought it deserved a better location. Not that she has to stop using the stand, but I figured that having a better place to bake her bread couldn't hurt. Right? So, I just loaned them some money to get started and they can pay me back over a few decades. I don't want to make much. I just want to have money coming in steadily. Besides, this means I will always be able to go to one spot and get my favorite bread. We both win, see?" Teresa was so overwhelmed by the news of her old friend's good fortune that she didn't even charge her patrons for the bread Lisbeth had brought. There was a lot of it, so Ryuji grabbed a couple of the sweetbread twists before they left again. The next destination was the market plaza just across the bridge. The older daughter, Senate, had a stand full of bread there. After explaining the situation to her for several minutes, they quickly packed up the remaining bread and the stand. The next destination was the market plaza near the northwest gate. Ryuji had never been to that one. There were a lot of places in the city that he hadn't been to yet. On the way, they talked a bit about the plaza that the younger daughter worked in. Ryuji was astonished to find out that there were market plazas dotted all through the city, and you could even get illegal items from them if you knew who to look for. He was equally astonished that anybody would have the stomach to buy food when they were that close to the northwest gate. Stables. This was a terrible location to sell bread from, but it looked like people were still going there despite the smell. The conversation came to a pause in front of the last of the bread stalls. The younger sister looked at the three of them for just a moment, then she got a big grin on her face. It was apparent from her expression that she already knew what was up. Once it was explained, she was left stunned. It turns out that she had guessed that they had gotten a building, but she had thought that they were getting a much smaller one that she had heard had also just sold. When she found out that they were getting the old bakery, she just about started to cry. Ryuji was intrigued, because he had yet to even set his sights on the new building he had purchased. The ladies packed the stand up, and each of the sisters carried a large sack of bread over their shoulder. From what Ryuji could see, the other stands had a focus on the cheaper types of bread, while Lisbeth's had a lot more of the more expensive types of bread. With their bread stowed away, the younger sister took the lead and showed them the way to the new storefront. The four of them hadn't gone very far when Janet, the younger sister, yelled to them that it was in the plaza just ahead. Ryuji looked to the side and was astounded to see Doran's shop, potions, and such, was just up the street from where they were currently. That would be all too convenient. Ryuji would be able to get his lunch so much quicker once the bakery was operational. When they entered the market plaza, there wasn't much question of which building it was. Off to the right was a rather large building with a huge chimney on the front. There were around a dozen people going in and out of the building at a frantic pace. Most of them carried cleaning supplies, but a couple looked like they might be apprentice carpenters or something similar. There was also a crowd of people looking on and speculating about the work going on. Ryuji walked up to the crowd of spectators to listen in. You see that? They got 2 carpenter crews and a mason in there. Who do you suppose bought it? How should I know? I bet it was one of the barons. Probably can't get rid of a daughter and is going to make her take on a trade. No. You two don't know anything. It would take years to get good enough at baking to make it worth buying a place like this. Probably some trader from down south, maybe even the capital. Oh yeah? And how would you know? Oh, I've kind of got a crush on the younger daughter of this baker lady who's been selling bread here for years. I just don't think she's noticed me. At this, Ryuji turned to see Janet turning red and her mother and sister grinning ear to ear. One of the other men grinned and clapped him on the shoulder before turning him around. Oh, I think she just did. There was a chorus of chuckles and catcalls as the two stared embarrassedly at one another. Ryuji smiled at them, but he had other business, so he walked on past. There was a large gruff-looking woman shouting orders to several of the people running about the place. He took her to be the forewoman? Anyway, he went up to her and she spared a quick glance, shouting a couple quick orders, before turning to face him fully. Can I help you, sir? Ryuji was quick with the compliment to try putting her at ease. Oh, you're helping me plenty. This looks splendid. Ah, yes. Let me introduce myself. My name is Ryuji and I just purchased this building and was hoping that you could give me and my tenants a quick tour of the property. I promise we won't keep you long. I just wanted the ladies to get an idea of the place they'll be running for me. Would you be so kind? I promise it'll be worth your trouble. After Ryuji pulled out a large copper, her eyes widened and she smirked. Really wish I could. Really wish I could. But if I don't stay on these lot, they'll just sit on their hands. She turned, put her hands together, stuck both pinkies in her mouth, and gave a shrill whistle, before yelling, "Mully, shake your tail." At the four-person's bellow, a thickly muscled fox beast folk girl came running over with a bandana wrapped around her head and her red hair and fox ears poking out the top. She was adorable, despite being taller and much broader than Ryuji. Her sizable cleavage might have helped in that regard. The four-person introduced her. This is Mully. If you'd allow, I'd like you to hire her for the tour instead. She's been all through the place by now. she'd be much better as a guide. Besides, she has a big family to feed and I've only got little old me. I'd just spend it on booze after work. After this bit of honesty, she and Ryuji had a laugh. He handed the large copper to the fox girl and just for good measure, he flipped a small copper to the foreperson. "We'll be in your care." He had actually been a bit astonished when he reached into his coin purse and found a large copper there instead of the small copper coins he was expecting. After a quick nod to the Baker trio, who for some reason seemed to have picked up a very happy-looking fourth, they all came walking over. The guy and the younger daughter, Janet, seemed to be in kind of a daze and were holding hands, so he wasn't sure how much they would get out of this tour. Just like that, the surprisingly shrill-voiced Molly began a tour of the building. The place was huge. Ryuji was amazed that such a huge building could be bought for just 12 small gold. He had to quickly reel himself in. 12 small gold was more money than most people in this world would ever see. Figuring the exchange rate based on something common to both worlds, Ryuji remembered buying meat skewers from street vendors back in Japan. A common one was around 100 yen, while a big one or a really good one might be about double. Thinking about portion sizes, he figured that the ones here would probably be on the upper end. If a skewer was 2 small coppers, then that would make the exchange rate a simple 100 yen per small copper. There was some muddling from the progression being in 8s instead of 10s, but that aside, that would make the amount he paid for this property right at about 5 million yen. It was extraordinarily cheap by his estimation. But then he was used to the kind of property costs you might expect in Japan. His parents lived in a cheap older place that was almost an hour from their work in Nara, and the price was still 70,000 yen a month. This place was a fixer-upper, but nowhere near bad enough condition to warrant the kind of price difference between what he was used to and this. Molly pointed out several weak spots in the floor for them to avoid, but overall, the place didn't look that bad at all. The ladies were in awe far more than Ryuji was. The building was 2 stories where the store was on the bottom and the living area was on top. The bottom had 4 large rooms. The one they walked into first was a mostly open area with wooden shelves and a counter. This was obviously the sales area. It opened onto the plaza and also onto the street on the other side of the building. In the rear of the room behind the counter were the stair leading up and a door leading deeper into the building. The next room back was the kitchen. It had a huge, kiln-like oven that took up one whole wall of the room. He figured with an oven that size, they could bake enough bread every day to sell to the whole city. The ladies were mesmerized by the sight until the mason walked in front of them and broke the trance. There were shelves and tables, and in one corner he even spotted a well. Lisbeth didn't miss that either, and she just smirked at him. Next was a room full of shelves and racks. He didn't get this one, and Sennett explained that this was the rising room where the bread was left to rise before baking. The last of the 4 rooms was a storage room, and there were several people in there with shovels getting the old grains and flour out by the wheelbarrow load. There was also a guy there with a sword, stabbing rats, that ran from the workers. There was a 5th room, but a privy isn't something you would want to talk about. The upper floor was divided into 8 rooms. There was a living room or study since it had a bookshelf with a couple books on it. There was a dining room next to the kitchen. The oven in the kitchen seemed to use the same chimney as the lower one, but it wasn't a fraction of the size. There was a privy right above the one downstairs. Then there were 3 bedrooms. Each was fairly big, and there were a few people bustling about up here, but not many. There was linen on the old beds, but it was all decayed. There was a lot of furniture here though. After the tour, the 3 women looked as dazed as Janet had before the tour, and the guy did too. They all started talking and crying and thanking Ryuji all at once. He just held up a hand, and when they quieted down, he smiled before speaking. "This is a business deal. There is no need to thank me, because you're going to be paying me back, remember? The workers have to finish the repairs and cleaning, but once that's done, I suggest you be ready to move your stuff in. You'll also need to secure enough supplies to run the store for a while, and don't forget that it'll use more of everything than you're used to. While we're on the subject of things you'll need, you might as well hire people to work in the store and to run the stalls. You could even get a few more stalls started in some of the other market plazas you told me about. Better go home and get to figuring out how much you need to get started. Also, I'm just curious, what are you going to do with all that bread? After looking at each other, they decided to give some of the bread out to all the workers. There was still a lot of bread left, so Ryuji suggested they give it to the local orphanage. The women all looked overjoyed at the idea, and they dragged the guy along as they headed off toward the northern slums. Just as they were about to run off, Ryuji mentioned to them that, since they were going to the slums, it might be a good time for them to fish around for workers for their bread stands and the new ones they would be opening. When Ryuji arrived back at the inn, Karen was waiting and practically jumped in his arms. She asked all about it, so he told her all the details over supper. Somehow there was a conspicuous lack of dishes that didn't involve some kind of bread. It was a glorious morning. Ryuji awoke refreshed from his great night of sleep. He was all too happy with the way things had turned out yesterday. He was looking forward to the day. Just then thunder resounded through the inn and he jumped reflexively. Looking out the window, he could tell that it was going to start pouring rain any moment. He got changed and busied himself with getting things together. He had considered spending a bit of time the previous night filling his satchel with copper coins. He didn't want to seem too suspicious though, so he decided to wait a couple days before going back to the money changers. After leaving the inn, he headed straight for the tax collection office. Aline answered the door almost immediately and Ryuji rushed in. It was just starting to sprinkle lightly and he wanted to get his documents back to the inn before it started raining in earnest. As if she could read his thoughts, Aline already had his documents rolled up in a waxed parchment and was holding it out to him when he entered. "Welcome back, my lord Ryuji. I have everything here and I double-checked everything for any mistakes. The map is current as is the info on the buildings for sale. I took the liberty of listing every building I had for sale, including the houses and the ones in the nobles district. I hope to see you soon." Ryuji took the roll of documents and bowed to her, offering his thanks before quickly departing. He had to run a bit near the inn to keep from getting wet. Once there, Ryuji took the protective parchment covering off and gave a cursory scan of the documents. The deed was just an unintelligible block of writing that he would have to spend time and concentration deciphering. The list of buildings was recognizable as such, but he couldn't freely read it yet either. The only thing he could immediately parse out was the map. It was a beautiful tanned heavy parchment sheet with a very detailed layout of the entire city rendered in black ink with dyes of various colors to distinguish the various districts. It was well worth the money to him to have such a quality map of the city. He guessed that this map was better than an average one and probably benefited from the skill of the elven artisan who rendered it. As soon as his documentation was safely stashed back in his room, Ryuji dashed off toward the old cat merchant, Gato. He wanted to have a quick word before going to the magic shop. He got there quickly and deftly, despite the slippery footing and mud. He was a little impressed that his new body was so capable. There weren't as many people as usual due to the rain, but he was surprised at how many there still were. He headed straight to the back of the plaza to speak with Gato about the places that were available. He hadn't brought most of the document with him because of the weather, but he figured he would at least tell the old cat that he had a list of places that were available. Rather than having the family just groping around for information on places, he could have them look at the ones that were available and pick from there. As he approached, the old man came out to greet him. "Why, hello. Glad to see you this morning. I got that satchel you ordered. We followed the picture you gave us, and I think it turned out really well. I think it will sell well with hunters and mercenaries too. I can't wait till we have a real shop to make stuff in. Our stuff will get even better then, you just watch." "I'm glad to hear it and I'm looking forward to it as well. I also brought something for you to look at." Ryuji ducked under the canopy and pulled out the list of properties available for sale. "I think this will help in the search for the new place." "Well, it probably would if I could read, but I never had the chance to learn much of my letters. Lived in the poor part of town since I moved here. My girls were as young as my grandkids back then. My wife had just died and I couldn't work the farm myself and take care of the kids. We moved to the city so I could get help from my aunt who lived here. We've been living in my aunt's house since then. Oh. Well, don't feel too bad. I'm only just learning how to read myself. Scowl if you want, but it's true, I assure you. I know how to read and write in my own language, but I'm having to learn to read and write here. That's so? So you can't read that either? Well, I can read it, but it's just really slowly right now. I'm practicing my reading and writing every day to get better. I'll teach you too if you want. No. I'm too old to start learning new things. But I would be really glad if you could teach my kids and grandkids their letters, but that'd probably take too much of your time. Forget I said anything. I don't mind, really. I'll teach them all a little at a time after I finish learning them myself. I don't know what to say. Imagine my family, reading, and such. I don't know how we could ever repay you, or actually there's no way we could. We'll serve you and your line from here on, my lord. If we survive this killer, that is. Gato chuckled a bit, but Ryuji was a little panicked for several reasons. What killer? What are you talking about? Oh, you haven't heard? There's a killer on the loose in the city. But you needn't worry, he only goes after beast folk and only women. I'm just worried about my daughters, but they're tough and fast, so they should be fine even if they do run into him. Are you serious? Is the guard looking for him? You can bet that the guard is keeping an eye out for him, but he always seems to strike when there's nobody around to see him. At first, the guard wasn't taking it very seriously, but now there've been 6 or 7 murders, so they have to. Still, it creeps me out thinking that somebody may be looking at my daughters and waiting for the right chance. What are they doing to track the killer down? What do you mean? This is the city. Tracking game in the woods is one thing, but tracking people in a city, especially one this size, is almost impossible. No, I mean, well, never mind. Oh, crap. I need to get going. I'll see you later. Ryuji left the market tucking the new and far larger satchel under his arm and headed to potions and such. He entered the shop in deep thought about the state of criminal investigation in this world. After greeting Dorn, he sat behind the counter and got out the thick tome and began laboriously translating the contents. He got to the point he was only having to reread every 4th or 5th word and only having to look for the meanings to 1 in 20. Dorn just shook his head. Lad, I donna think we'll be a-sellin' anythin' on such a day. Why didn't you be talking your book with ye, and get ye some rest today? Ryuji agreed and stuck the book in his new satchel with a waxed parchment over it to be sure it was safe. He also stuck his other satchel inside, but after a moment's consideration, he took it back out and used it to cover the smaller, almost dictionary-type book before stuffing the bundle back into the cavernous new satchel. With the book safely secured, Ryuji left the store for the day. He intended to read, but he wanted to check over all the documents that he got from Aline first. He got back to the inn, and Karen gave him a big plate of warm sweet bread with a big smile. While he was eating the bread, he chatted with Karen about the new shop and the prospect of finding a new shop for the leatherworkers. The look in her eyes as he told her about the prospect of buying yet another property was one of joy and wonder. As usual, Teresa watched the two with a smile on her face from a distance, but this time there was something else in her expression. Karen had talked of nothing except her new boyfriend and his marvelous business sense. Teresa had to wonder again why such a wealthy man was staying in her hotel. It wasn't that she minded the coin, and she certainly enjoyed the added budget that not having to buy as much food afforded, but she still had her suspicions. At first, she just figured that the handsome young elf lord was after her young waitress, but recently she began suspecting there might be more he was after. As always, she would have to keep an eye on him. Once he was safely back in his room, Ryuji took off the heavy sword belt and satchel and sat at his desk to begin studying his documents. With the map and list in front of him, he was able to parse out which buildings were listed for sale. The list was a bit longer than he had originally suspected, and the city was a bit bigger than he thought also. After a quick appraisal, Ryuji realized that there were literally hundreds of buildings in the city, but probably not quite 1,000. After a few passes over the list, Ryuji marked the ones that looked to him to be in his price range and decent in size. He tried to figure out where the cats lived, but all he could tell for sure was that it was somewhere in the district marked as the northern slums. The names of the districts could be slightly confusing since there was a northern slums but no other slums were listed. However, he took it all in stride and began marking the map with easily removed charcoal. After his business matters were settled, he settled into his studies. He was so focused on reading the book that he didn't realize what time it was until he started having trouble focusing on the words and realized that it was getting dark outside. Once he came to that startling realization, he took a break and headed down to eat dinner. The reason he was so absorbed in his study was that he had finally gotten the knack of reading in the local language. He had finally gotten enough vocabulary figured out that he was able to start figuring unknown words out by context clues alone. Armed with his newfound understanding, he had finished nearly half the book in that one sitting. It left him with a bit of a headache and some eye strain, not to mention hungry, but mostly it just left him far more knowledgeable about magic. After his meal, Ryuji went back to his room, but this time he began diligently filling his new and much sturdier satchel with large copper. This was the very reason he had this satchel made, and it took him well into the night to fill it up. At one point before it got too late in the night, he went down and got some larger and smaller change from Teresa. He mixed in some of the small copper and even a few small silver into the satchel full of large copper coins. This mixture would look much more like a collection gotten from various merchants than only large copper. His coins packed and ready for the next day, he settled down at the desk and began reading for a bit longer. To a boy raised in Japan, the idea of learning magic was super exciting, and he found that he had very little trouble learning. He told himself that he would only read one more page, then another, and so on until he fell asleep at his desk. At some point in the middle of the night, Karen knocked on his door. When she got no reply, she unlocked his door and came into his room. Seeing the sleeping form of the handsome sun elf slumped over a book, snoring quietly warmed her heart. She put him in his bed and tucked him in. As she did, her face came very close to his sleeping face and she paused. Unable to stop herself, she leaned in further and placed a gentle kiss on his sleeping lips. Blushing a deep crimson at her own audacity, Karen closed the book, blew out the lamp, and rushed out of his room, being careful to relock the door as she left. Ryuji awoke to find another overcast day, but it didn't look like it would rain. After completing what had become his morning routine, he headed downstairs. While he was eating breakfast, Karen seemed a bit more flustered than usual, but he had things to accomplish today so he left rather quickly. Ryuji headed to the market to quickly speak to Gato about the buildings available. Gato was just getting all the items set out in the stall. Ryuji told him that he had a map of all the available locations in town and showed him the map. Gato looked at the map very carefully and studied the locations marked. He then asked if Ryuji could come with him to his house that evening so they could all look at the map. Ryuji agreed and then rushed off because he had other business that morning. On his way to potions and stuff, he was worried about the cat women out looking for buildings on his behalf, but he had to put it out of his mind as he stopped by the money changers and quickly sat at Shon's desk. Besides, the killer wouldn't strike so soon after his last victim, right? Shon seemed a bit startled to see him only a few days after his last visit, but Ryuji waved it off saying that business was good. When Shon looked as if he would question it further, Ryuji pulled out the alibi he'd been working on this whole time. He told the boy that he had money deals with 11 different businesses. The kid was startled by the fact that he had so many deals going at once, but Ryuji wasn't about to tell him that most of those were street stalls. He was equally unwilling to admit that 4 of the 11 businesses were part of the same bakery. He did, however, tell Shon that he was preparing to open the new bakery and that he needed funding for it. The kid looked bewildered by the idea that he had been singled out to do all the transactions for that many businesses. He had heard about the bakery being fixed up, but he hadn't realized that Ryuji was the one who bought it, and his eyes shone when he heard the news. Shon was doubly surprised by the sheer volume of coins that Ryuji piled on his desk from the enormous blue satchel. His business concluded, Ryuji left his customary tip for the boy and headed out. Shon's eyes sparkled. This was the third time in an 8-day that this elf guy had left him a tip. He had made more from Ryuji's tips than he had earned in wages this 8-day. Shon began to wonder if perhaps he had attracted the elf's eye somehow, but then he remembered the vision of beauty he had with him the other day and dismissed the notion as absurd. Ryuji arrived back at the wizard's shop and yelled for Dorn in excitement. When he told Dorn about reading over half the book, the normally surly dwarf bellowed with laughter and told him to take the day off. Dorn explained that he should take a day off and let his mind rest a bit. Ryuji was very excited to finish the book, but he agreed that a day off might be nice. He was a little reluctant because he had just taken half a day off yesterday, but Dorn said it didn't count since he had spent the whole time reading. Ryuji left in high spirits because he knew just what he wanted to do on his day off. He thanked Dorn and headed straight for the market and Gato. His intent was to have the old guy search around for his family so they could all go look at buildings together. Things did not go according to plan. On his way to the market, Ryuji heard a scream and suddenly someone started yelling that the murderer had killed another victim. His breath caught and his blood ran cold. There was another murder? It couldn't be the cat women, could it? Ryuji ran in the direction of the commotion as quickly as his legs would carry him. As he arrived at the scene of the commotion, he found a huge group of people clustered around a small knot of soldiers. There was just enough space that Ryuji was able to navigate between them. When he was almost to the knot of soldiers, he tripped over someone's foot and stumbled into the center of the circle the soldiers were making. He managed to catch himself just short of falling on the corpse lying on the ground. As he was steadying himself, he got a good look at the woman lying on the cobbled street. The woman was indeed one of the beast folk, but she was something more like a sheep or goat than a cat. Ryuji was just straightening up with a sigh of relief when he heard a familiar voice yelling to him. As he turned, he spotted the captain of the guard that he had spoken to before bearing down on him. "What do you think you're doing? Who gave you permission to— Oh, it's you. You should still stand back unless you have some business here." Ryuji was just about to agree with him but then caught himself and asked a question that had been bothering him. He stepped closer to the captain so they wouldn't be overheard by everyone in the crowd before he spoke in a hushed tone. "Actually, I was wondering if you had any leads to tracking down the murderer? You obviously don't have to tell me anything, but I'd be happy to help if I can." The captain pushed the boiled monster leather helmet back a bit and regarded Ryuji with skeptical eyes. Ryuji could feel the intensity in his gaze, but there was something else there too: desperation. Finally, the captain seemed to have reached a decision and leaned in closer. "For some reason, I just have this feeling that you might just be able to tell me something I don't know. Alright, listen closely. We don't have a lot to go on, because the person responsible always seems to be able to avoid being seen committing the murders. We think it might be one of the guards, because the wounds all look like they were made with guard weapons." When the captain said that, Ryuji looked around the circle. The captain assumed that he was looking amongst the guards, but in reality, he was looking at the weapons they were holding. All but the captain were wielding halberds, a cross between a long spear and an axe. The captain nodded before continuing as Ryuji looked at the dead woman again. "That's another reason we think it might be a guard. Nobody would suspect one of our own town guard until it was too late. I probably shouldn't have told you that, but I just feel like you are somebody that might be able to see something that I haven't. This is the third murder victim that I've had to look at personally, and I just want it to stop." As Ryuji looked at the captain, he noticed the man was clenching his fist so tight that his knuckles were white. He then diverted his gaze back to the dead woman. The hole in her chest and throat did look like they could have been made by a spear of some type. From the looks of the wounds, it appeared to his untrained eyes as if the woman had been stabbed through the throat from behind and then stabbed in the heart while she was already on the ground. However, there was something about the scene that just didn't seem right. Ryuji stepped closer and looked over the stab wounds. For some reason, his eyes seemed drawn to the blood on the ground. It was very different than the blood in the dramas that he'd seen on TV, and he almost gagged as he got a whiff of the pungent odor of the blood. Still, his eyes were drawn to the blood, and then he spotted it, a footprint in the edge of the blood. As Ryuji knelt down at the edge of the blood, the captain and a couple of the guards as well as several of the citizens gasped, and the captain was about to rush over to grab him. When he got close, he noticed what Ryuji was looking at, and just as he did, Ryuji looked at the captain's feet. When the captain looked down, he was unsure what this strange elf noble was looking at. Then Ryuji stood without a word and began studying the feet of all of the guards present. The captain's face went white as realization dawned on him. The killer had stepped in the victim's blood. The killer would have blood on his feet. They just might catch him this time. But just as he was getting ready to congratulate Ryuji, he noticed that the elf had stopped looking at the guard's boots and was heading back, shaking his head. When Ryuji drew close again, he spoke to the captain in a low voice again. "It wasn't one of your men." Seeing the captain's perplexed look, he pointed to the captain's own boots. The print doesn't have a ring around it. You and all of your men are wearing greaves that cover the front of your feet. The footprint doesn't match your type of boots either. I think somebody is trying to frame the guard for the murders that have been happening." The captain had to nod at that, but Ryuji followed it up with a couple questions. "This is important, we have to move quick. Was there anybody that has been in the barracks recently who isn't a guard? Especially anybody in there today?" The captain's face began to go a little pale. "There was one man who was in the barracks today. In fact, he's in our barracks often enough that he could have done it every time there was a murder. He's a merchant that we have a contract with for our equipment though. It'll be really hard to hold him, and we probably can't keep him for long unless we can prove he did this." Ryuji got a big malicious grin on his face before replying. "There is always only one truth. Just see if you can get hold of him quickly, and I'll do the rest. I'll meet you at the barracks in the Nobles District in a little bit. I have to prepare for this first, but I think we can catch him bloody-handed if he's the one who did it. It'll probably take me about a candle's pan. See you then." The captain looked like he wanted to protest, but Ryuji was already sprinting away. Instead, he began frantically issuing orders. His relief was profound, his men weren't killing anyone. He silently prayed that the strange elf noble could actually do as he said. The captain was almost afraid that Ryuji was just going to use some connections to pin everything on the merchant, but somehow, he didn't think that was what he had in mind. Ryuji burst into the front door of potions and stuff and yelled for Dorn. The old man came out a little flustered and started to admonish Ryuji for coming back on his day off. "No time for that. I need some things quickly. Do you have any black rust powder? Also, do you have any hardened tree sap that isn't a solid stone yet?" As Dorn got those things together, he raced into the back of the shop and grabbed a small shovel and broom used for cleaning up rock debris. Ryuji looked around but couldn't find what he was looking for, so he took the cleaning set and a mortar and pestle set and raced for a nearby building. When he got to the bakery, he almost did a somersault, trying to slow down. Ryuji raced inside after only a cursory greeting with the foreman woman. He ran into the kitchen and looked around inside the chimney flue, but to his dismay, it was clean already. When a familiar fox woman came over, he was about in tears. Molly was more than a little concerned that maybe they had screwed up somehow. "Morning, Mr. Owner. What's wrong? Did we mess up somehow? If you tell me, I'm sure we can fix whatever it is." No. I was just looking for an ingredient for the potion shop, but it seems I'm too late." "An ingredient for the potion shop? What kind of ingredient would you find in here?" "I was hoping to find a bit of chimney soot, but the chimney is already clean, I see. I can't complain about people doing a good job even if I could have used that right now. I'll go now and let all of you get back to work." "Chimney soot? What would you use?" "Oh, wait. This chimney is clean, but I doubt they've cleaned the part upstairs yet. Come with me, I'll get the soot if that's what you want." 10 minutes later, the woman was crawling out of the chimney access and was covered in soot from the cleavage up. She held out a mortar full of something that used to be called lampblack, and her dazzling white smile was a stark contrast to her black face and chest. Ryuji grabbed the mortar from her and tossed her a large silver. As her eyes went wide, she was gearing up to protest, but Ryuji was already gone. About an hour and a half, after he had parted with the guard captain, Ryuji strolled confidently into the guard barracks in the nobles' district. The captain was waiting for him and looked a bit worried, unlike Ryuji. "Why do you look like the monster that ate the mercenary? You do have a plan, right, Milahem, sir?" Ryuji grinned at him and nodded. He had secretly always wanted to be like a certain kid detective on TV. He had even watched a lot of criminal investigation shows from America to see how they did things, and here he was getting to put that knowledge to use. "Can you show me to this merchant? I think we need to have a little chat. Pick a couple guys that are pretty good at spotting things, and bring them with us, okay? If this works, and the guy really did do it, we'll know soon enough." There was an actual interrogation room in the barracks, complete with implements of torture. Ryuji was a little shocked when he spotted them, but the man sitting at the table looked far more than shocked. He looked sick as Ryuji sat opposite him. The peevish-looking man with short golden hair and arrogant eyes looked at Ryuji with a mixture of fear and defiance. Then he began yelling in a whiny nasal voice that seemed designed to grate on one's nerves. "Who are you? I demand you let me go. I've done nothing wrong, and I guarantee that the Count will hear about this. You have no reason to keep me here." Ryuji smiled at the man and then laid into him with a barrage of questions. Before entering the room, he had told the captain and the guards not to speak, but just to watch the man's responses. He told them to pay close attention to the direction the man's eyes were looking as he answered questions, and to watch his hands and body as the stress ramped up. Ryuji started with simple questions like the guy's name and job. He soon asked the man where he was that morning, and the man gave him a running dialogue, but Ryuji noticed that he kept looking up and right. With a grin, Ryuji pressed him on details about one of the businesses he supposedly visited that morning, and the man began fidgeting with a ring and was constantly looking up and right. "Gotcha, liar," was going through Ryuji's mind. Ryuji asked him which barracks he had visited that morning, and he said it was the one in the center of town. This time he was fidgeting with a shirt button, but he did look up and left, so Ryuji assumed he was telling the truth. But when he asked if he had left any equipment there or any deliveries, the man flinched and drew his hand to cover his mouth before speaking. He said that he'd only looked over their inventory, but his eyes were up and right again, and he was now turning unconsciously toward the door. Too easy, Ryuji thought. Last question. What do you think of beastfolk women? The man began breathing heavily, and sweat actually started beading on his forehead. His eyes stayed down and to the left for a couple minutes before he responded. That was some long internal debate there. Dude, could you look any more guilty? I guess I like them as much as the next guy. I don't really have an opinion either way. Ryuji stood. Very well. We have several others to interview, so it might be a while before we can release you. Be patient and justice will prevail. He then flashed his most disarming smile as he left the room. The moment they were outside the room, the captain, who had at some point introduced himself as Cries, jumped at him. What was that? We didn't find out anything. I thought you were going to interrogate him, or did you decide he isn't the guy we're after? Ryuji grinned and shook his head in the negative for a second. Nah, that's definitely our guy. I even know where he hid the evidence we need. It's all in the guard barracks. Let's be quick and don't let anybody let this guy go. On the way over to the Midtown barracks, he explained that during high-tension interrogation that looking up and right meant someone was thinking up a scene to lie about, and that straight right was the sounds to lie about. On the other hand, if they are looking left, they are usually remembering a fact. If down and right, it's thinking over their feelings, while down and left is arguing with themselves. He then went on to explain that people often lean forward under tension if they're telling the truth, but lean back if lying. He explained a bunch of body gestures, including hand gestures and grinding teeth. By the time they arrived, every one of the men accompanying him was looking at him as though he were already a wizard or some kind of sage. Ryuji had one more big trick for them. The guards were ready to arrest the merchant on what they had, but Ryuji told them to wait because they were about to have all the proof they needed. When they entered the barracks, the captain in charge there wanted to protest, but cries told him to shut up and just watch. Ryuji knew what he was looking for and went right to the locker cubbies. Under one of the cubbies was a pair of shoes. Ryuji smiled and pulled out a feather duster. He used the handle to scoot the shoes out. These were finely crafted, boiled leather shoes with a glossy sheen to the green-dyed leather. Definitely not the kind of shoes that you would think of a guard wearing, even off-duty. As Ryuji used the handle of the duster to tilt the shoes, a line of dried brown blood became apparent near the sole. Ryuji looked up into the amazed eyes of Captain Cries and his men, but he wasn't done yet. "Whose locker is this?" Cries looked at the other captain, who was scowling with a hurt look on his face. "His name is Vries. He's a good man. There's no way he would commit murders like that." Ryuji shook them all with his next piercing question and maniacal grin. "Tell me. Is this Vries a beast folk?" "He is, isn't he?" "He's also innocent." The captain looked relieved, but also curious. Ryuji then pulled out his secret weapon. It was an inconspicuous metal box. He opened the box, careful not to spill any of the black dust inside. Then he began swishing the feather duster through the dust and over the shoes. After a second, he found what he was after with a grin. He then stood and examined the halberd. Without hesitation, he began dusting the halberd the same way. Finally, the captain had had enough with this weird elf and his antics. "What in the name of all the gods do you think you're doing? That weapon belongs to one of my men and I demand you leave it alone. Are you putting poison on it?" "What is that?" With a grin, Ryuji turned. "So glad that you asked. I was just proving that your man didn't commit any murders and destroying any chance of the real killer getting away with the crimes. Come over and watch closely. What I'm about to do is pull the killer's fingerprints off of these two items. Obviously, your man touched his own weapon, but I bet that the killer is the only one who touched these shoes. By finding fingerprints that match on these two items, and then checking the fingerprints of the suspect against them, we can be for sure whether he was the one who killed the latest victim." As the guards and the two captains clustered close, Ryuji pressed a piece of paper covered in a thin layer of gummy glue against the shoe's toe where he had been dusting before. As they watched in amazement, the paper came away with several finger and thumbprints. Ryuji held the paper out for one of the guards to take and then pressed a new piece of paper to the shaft of the halberd in several places. This paper he handed to another guard. "Keep those separate and don't touch the surface or fold the paper. Those fingerprints belong to the killer and nobody else, while those may have some of the guard's prints mixed in. The fine trace of blood on the back of the halberd's tip decorations is certainly the same as the blood on the edge of those shoes. That blood belongs to the victim from today. Now that we have all our evidence, all we need to do is get the suspect's fingerprints on this third sheet and compare them. If possible, I would like one of you with really good attention to detail to compare the fingerprints. If any of the fingerprints from these items matches even a single print from the suspect, it will be irrefutable proof that he's the killer because nobody in the world has the same fingerprints." Following Ryuji's announcement about the nature of fingerprints, looks of awe and sudden comprehension bloomed on the faces of everyone there at the barracks. The whole group marched over to the other barracks. The suspect refused to let them take his fingerprints and caused a big commotion. By the time Ryuji arrived in the room, the man was unconscious and leaning on the table. Ryuji didn't ask any questions, he just dusted the man's fingers in the black powder and rolled them one at a time over the tacky paper. As soon as he was done, he handed the sheet to a guard that was waiting for it. It took the man less than 3 minutes to find a perfect match on all 3 pages. The guards all cheered and the unconscious merchant was dragged off to one of the holding cells. Suddenly Ryuji found himself surrounded by guards yelling things like, "How did you do that? How did you know all those things? And wow, are you ever smart?" As embarrassed as he was, he still took that opportunity to explain to all of the guards about fingerprints. He then cautioned them that most fingerprints that could be pulled up would be too poor to use, but sometimes you would get lucky. He told them that most prints wouldn't be whole and cautioned them that prints could be planted, but it was hard to do so unless it was a high noble or royalty being accused. It probably wouldn't happen. He also got asked by several people how to make the powder and the paper, but that he refused to tell. Instead, he told them that if they needed any that they could just order some from potions and such wizarding shop. They all clamored to find out how he knew it was there and were all stunned speechless when he told them that he was Dorn's new apprentice wizard. He left the barracks in a great mood, but then he remembered the murdered woman and he got depressed. At least the sorry bastard won't be getting away this time, he told himself. He started to feel a bit better when he remembered that he had also made progress on protecting the local children from drowning. Now I just need to get a certain family of beast folk settled into a new store, and then I can settle down and concentrate on my wizard studies. A few minutes later, it started raining and Ryuji cursed and ran to the inn. Later, at the Duke's estate. Sitting in an elaborate but well-padded desk chair, behind a huge ornate desk covered in papers and a few scrolls and maps, was a single man. This man had the bearing of a high noble that he had trained since birth to go with his buff physique and handsome good looks. His stature was the result of many years of military service. A military that he would still be a part of if not for a severe shoulder injury that prevented him from being able to swing a sword. This man was of course the Duke of the city of Lyril, Duke Alphonse Reynold Ars Lyril. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, with short bob of brown hair and unnerving hazel eyes. Normally he perpetually wore a slight scowl owing to the pressures of running one of the larger walled cities in the Tsoaf kingdom and from the usual flow of depressing news coming from the ever-present war front that was alarmingly close to his fair city. This day, however, found the Duke in a quite jovial mood, despite the foul weather outside the window. In front of the Duke stood one of his guard captains, a man named Crass or something. The Duke made a mental note not to try using the man's name till he made sure he knew what it was, and prepared to throw forth a barrage of questions as he gazed once again at the astonishing report in his hand. "Are you certain of the information in this report? This seems this seems entirely too good to be true. Did we really catch the killer? He's actually in our custody right now? And we know for sure we got the right man?" As Guard Captain Kryes nodded with a huge grin on his face, the Duke continued. "But how? Did he finally mess up and get caught committing a murder? Did somebody credible see it happen?" Kryes looked a little nervous and scratched his hair looking off to the side as he replied. "No, my lord, the killer was actually caught using a new method. I detailed all of it in the report. I dare say that I'm not the best choice to explain this new method, but it involves fingerprints. It was shown to us by the new young wizard who's apprenticing with the old wizard in town." Duke Lyril had a bemused expression on his face. He wasn't sure he heard that quite right. He had known Dorn Firefist for a long time, including serving with the stubborn old mage during his time in the military. It was for that reason that the old guy had come to him when he retired from the military. The Duke was only too happy to find a good spot for him to open a wizarding shop in town, although he had really hoped at the time that the old man would begin training wizards that he could send to the war front. Instead, the stubborn old coot had refused every potential mage that came his way, claiming that none of them had any talent for wizardry. It had been the Duke cringed at the realization that it was about 15 years ago that his old war buddy had come to him. He lamented the gray in his beard and hair every time he saw his reflection, and this only served to remind him of how old he was getting. Still, to think that Dorn would take on an apprentice after what the Duke had heard was 50 years of refusing. This guy must be quite amazing to convince the stubborn old coot to teach him. The Duke began reading the report in hand again and finally got to the part about the new wizard. Something caught his attention. The wizard was a sun elf named Ryuji. Where had he heard that name? It had been something recent. The Duke set about tearing through the piles of paper on his desk until he was holding the offending report. It was a transfer of ownership rights report from the tax office. The new owner of the property was listed as Lord Ryuji. That was a bit strange. Why was this one named as Lord? He looked pointedly at the captain. Was this elf a noble by chance? The captain looked a little startled at first and just nodded his head. Then he looked pensive for a moment until realization dawned on him. I suppose I did forget to mention that in my report. You see, my lord, Sir Ryuji asked that I not address him as a noble, because he lost his memory. I did mention that in brief in my request to let the guards teach swimming lessons for the citizens, but that was several days ago. As the captain mentioned it, the memory surfaced about that report as well, and a smile spread over the Duke's face. He had just gotten a great idea. He beckoned the captain over as he pulled a fresh sheet of letterhead and drew his quill from the inkwell. A quarter candle's pan later, Captain Kryes was standing in the tax office, delivering the Duke's letter. The woman in the office looked utterly bewildered as she read the note. She checked the authenticity of the seal, but then she remembered that one of the captains of the guard had personally delivered it and looked back at the man. He looked like he was waiting for something. Tell the Duke that I will be certain to fulfill his request. At her words, the captain gave a shallow bow and exited the office. Aline sat back in her deep-cushioned armchair and took the cup of tea that the butler offered to her. How was she going to find him? The Duke had ordered it, so there was no question of whether, it was only a matter of how. She would have to find Lord Ryuji, but how? Then she remembered that he wanted to buy another piece of property, and she sat back in her chair and relaxed. She only needed to wait for him to come back. There was the other part, but surely she could enjoy her tea before rushing into that. Ryuji awoke and got into his freshly cleaned clothes, smelling the fabric with a smile. The previous day, he had returned to the inn and washed all his dirty clothing in the rain and hung it up in his room to dry. He had then spent the evening reading until it was getting dark. Then he donned his bathing poncho and met with the old cat's family again as they had planned. He told them which buildings were for sale and said he would meet with them sometime around lunch to look at the buildings with them. Once he was done with his morning routine, he headed to the wizard shop. When he got close, he spotted a note on the door and walked up to look at it. The note was to him. It simply said, Ryuji, I got sick and don't feel like opening the store today. Study on your own. Ryuji was a little worried about Dorn, but he wasn't going to miss this opportunity. He dashed back to the market as quickly as he could. In just a few minutes, he was standing at the old cat's stall, catching his breath. Oh, Lord Ryuji. What brings you here this morning? I thought we were going to go out at midday. That was the plan, but I found myself free this whole day, so I figured if I had the time we could all just go looking together. Where would everyone else be? Oh, splendid. Everyone is at the house packing up our stuff. The boys even took off work to help my daughters with the packing, so they're all there. Ah, good. Hey, I know. Point to where your home is on the map here. I'll run to your house and get everyone to come here and you close up the store. Or even better, you close up the store and go to your house. I'll go there and help pack until you get there. Oh, no, my lord. We couldn't possibly have you laboring on our behalf. You've already done so much for us, it just wouldn't be right. We'll pack our stuff. It shouldn't take me but a few moments to close the shop, then I'll meet you and them in the center plaza here like you suggested before. Our house is here, he said, pointing to a small building near the back of the slums. Oh, okay. If you really think everyone would feel that way, then I'll just go get them and meet you. Later. Ryuji ran off with the old cat staring after him with a warm grin on his face. When Ryuji arrived at their house, the door was open and there was a lot of commotion inside. Just as he had been told, the men had stayed home to help their wives pack, and even the children were busy rummaging through things and putting them in wooden crates. Everyone paused and stared in shock and bewilderment as he entered the front door. After they got over their initial shock at being seen in such a state of disarray, it only took them a few minutes to get ready and set out. They met Gato in the central square a few minutes later. Finally, it was time to begin looking at properties in earnest. After more than an hour of looking, it wasn't going too well. The cat beast folk were all too timid to speak up about the places they went to look at. When they did speak, it was to say that the places that they were being shown were too nice for the like of them. It was honestly getting a little annoying. The only ones that were being honest with their opinions were the children. At one place, one of the young girls had grabbed her nose and protested that the place reeked of dead things. Ryuji could only catch a trace of the smell, but he suspected that any beast folk would be horrified by the stench. The girl's mother was equally horrified, but Ryuji just laughed and said, "Got it, not this one then." Later at one of the larger but oddly cheaper buildings, the boy looked at the place and declared in a voice of contempt, "I could push this moldy building over by myself. This place stinks of mold and wood bugs." Again the parents were aghast, but Ryuji took what the boy said to heart. He suspected that wood bugs might be termites, and any place that smelled of mold and termites was a definite no-go. They had visited a number of the cheapest places, and were only left with the places that were more expensive. Ryuji was a little concerned about having enough to foot the bill if they picked a place that was too expensive. He decided he would just have to go to the money changer with another satchel full of copper coins. After looking over one of the more expensive places, they went to look at another that had a huge floor space and a very nice layout. The price tag on this one was a little more than what he had on him at the moment, but he decided that if they would just settle on this one, he would be happy enough. He was just worrying about them rejecting this one in favor of a more expensive one when one of the young cat women shattered his expectations. She looked almost afraid to speak, but Ryuji encouraged her to speak up. "Milord, are there perhaps any places available in the Northern District? We couldn't possibly move into any of the places you've shown us so far. They were all far too nice for the likes of us. We don't need anything really fancy, so you needn't waste money on our account. I know that you and Father spoke about us moving into a new store, but it can't be all right for us to move into a building like one of these. We wouldn't want your reputation with people to fall because of associating with us." Ryuji was dumbfounded for a moment. She had blindsided him with her scathing self-critique, and it finally all came into perspective. He couldn't let this stand. "Ah, but you are wrong. You see, as a noble, I have to show off a bit if I want to make others recognize my name. Most nobles would settle for just having a fancy storefront that obviously spoke of how much money was poured into it. I, however, intend to go further. I will have those that come to my store see that not only do I spend my money to have a nice storefront, but that I would spend that much even on the likes of you, as you put it. Besides, the bakery that I put Lisbeth up in is half again this size, even if it is a little more run down. The work crews are making short work of the repairs though, and soon enough even those few flaws will be good as new. I could put you all in a place like that, you know. That would certainly force you to adapt to being the center of attention." After his little speech, the adults huddled together and began whispering furiously with one another. Shortly thereafter, one of the guys spoke to Ryuji, even though the women looked obviously nervous about whatever their decision had been. "Milord, we wish to apologize. We had no idea that you intended to use us to build your reputation in that way. It might be a bit outside our way of thinking, but I must admit what you say makes sense. Perhaps you would be willing to let us look at a couple of the ones from before? Maybe the ones from the northwestern part of the business district?" After that, things went pretty quickly. They settled on one of the medium-sized buildings that was perhaps a little old, but fairly nice all the same. They all looked uncomfortable with the idea of being doted on this way, but Ryuji was determined to help them even if he had to do so against their wishes at first. Soon enough, they were off to the tax office to make the final purchase. When they arrived at the tax office, the beast folk all refused to go inside. They said things like, "This is no place for the likes of us, and we can't embarrass you in front of others, milord." It was all a bit frustrating to Ryuji, but he refused to let it get to him. For a boy raised in Japan, where cooperation with foreigners was compulsory, the intolerance was a little baffling. However, he wasn't going to push the issue because he could tell there was a grain of truth to what they said. Ryuji walked into the tax collector's office after knocking, and there was Aline sitting in her armchair as before. When she looked up and saw it was him, she practically started beaming. He wondered if she had a thing for him and decided she might have a point. In this life he was tall, handsome, and, most of all, he was rich. He decided to put that line of uncomfortable reasoning aside as Aline got to her feet. The butler at her side seemed to catch some visual cue since he bowed and turned to leave. Was this it? Was this the scene where Aline began aggressively coming on to him? Just as Ryuji's mind began forming excuses, he realized she was heading for her desk and realized he was being childish. Once Ryuji was seated at the desk facing her, Aline pulled a small stack of papers from the top drawer and sat them atop her desk. A moment later, the butler set a cup of tea in front of him after materializing out of nowhere. After he sat a fresh cup next to her, he took up a position behind her, and she chose that moment to resume her activities. Aline held out several of the papers to Ryuji with a bright smile. The moment he laid eyes on them, he knew what they were, because he already had one like them. Most of the papers he had been handed were the titles to pieces of property with buildings listed on them. There were 6 of these titles, and a few more pages after that. At first, Ryuji assumed that Aline was being helpful and had gathered what she figured to be the 6 most likely buildings he would purchase. However, as he looked over the last 3 papers in the small stack, he realized that wasn't correct. The last 3 papers in the stack listed the business formation and land title purchases of a company listed as Markiel Holdings. After Ryuji finished looking through the papers in confusion, Aline handed him a final piece of paper without saying a word. Ryuji took the piece of paper that seemed to be a note and picked up his tea to take a sip. He read a few lines, and then nearly did a spit take when he read over a certain line. This line stated that all the holdings of this company were to be transferred to Lord Ryuji. It wasn't until that moment that he thought to check the letterhead, and when he did it left such a lump in his throat that he had to gulp the rest of his tea to clear it out. Ryuji recognized the seal on the page, and the name was Lyril, just like the city. This letter was addressed to Aline, and it was from none other than the Duke of the city. Ryuji took another moment to digest the contents of the note. In brief, it stated that the titles and holdings of Markiel Holdings were to be rewritten with Ryuji as the owner. He was to be given the titles to all the properties including 2 that had liens on them, and the debt was to be cleared from the record under order of the Duke. It went on to insist that Aline seek him out and give him all of this as his own personal property. Ryuji looked up at Aline with bewilderment written all over his face. It must have been fairly comical, because Aline was unable to hold back a chuckle. Ryuji couldn't help asking his next question. But, why? Why did the Duke of all people decide to just give this to me? And doesn't this already belong to the Markiel family? I don't get this at all. Aline let out another small chuckle before answering. You really don't get it, do you? It's only been half a day, but even I have heard that the guard finally caught the murderer who has been keeping the city in the grips of fear. I've even been hearing rumors about how the guard seized a certain wealthy merchant who happens to be named Markiel. I've even heard one rumor about how some sun elf was spotted looking at the body of the last victim before him, and several of the guards dashed off at a run. Now I wonder, you don't suppose that these rumors could be connected to this letter somehow, do you? Aline sat back with a smug look as she regarded Ryuji. The enormity of his actions finally dawned on him, and he suddenly realized that it was pretty obvious that the Duke would take notice in retrospect. Perhaps it would be different if he were a commoner, but the pendant around his neck proclaimed him as part of the nobility. The Duke couldn't afford to ignore his actions. From all that Ryuji had been able to gather, Lyril only had a small collection of nobility. At the top was the Duke who ruled the region and ultimately controlled most of the land in and around Lyril. It was a hereditary title that had been passed down to the current Duke Lyril. The title was inherited, but Ryuji had heard that if a noble did too bad of a job in their posting, that the king would lower their rank and the scope of their holdings along with it. That meant that even though the Duke had been handed his title, he was still doing a good enough job or he wouldn't have been able to keep it. The next after him was Count Rourke. The Count was in overall charge of the guard and the military stationed in or dispatched from the city. He and the Duke were both military men, but he was an active commander who was just on leave for the time. With a war that had lasted for 100 years, it was certainly understandable that the king wouldn't keep the commanders and troops on the front lines at all times. The Count also controlled large tracts of land, but most of them were outside the city, and he was also in charge of the wall around the city. After the Count, there were 3 barons who owned small tracts of land either inside or outside the city. They each had a minor role they were in charge of as well. One of them was the city's finance minister, another was the minister of agriculture, and the last one was the minister of city development. The first one was Aline's direct boss, but he supposed she probably had to answer to all three at times. All of these were things that Ryuji had managed to pick up from conversation, and intuition was used to fill in any gaps. All of this meant that, if he was nobility, he was now roughly equivalent to one of the barons. He had a claim to noble birthright, he had money, and now he had been granted land in the city as his personal holding. Ryuji finally came to the startling realization that most people would never hold the title to properties in their hand, even after they bought them. Holding the title was a privilege reserved only for nobility. Suddenly Aline's deference to him made more sense. She had spotted his pendant at some point and knew he was a noble. He knew he had been stiff and formal with her the first time he met her, because he thought he might be in the wrong place, but that wouldn't merit somebody calling you Lord, would it? He chastised himself for not noticing sooner. Ryuji came to a decision quickly. There was only one thing to be done in a situation such as this. He would need to write a letter of thanks to the Duke for the gift, and what a gift it was too. When he told Aline as much, she led him to a small library study and pulled out a small stack of paper and a quill and inkwell before leaving him alone. Ryuji took out his journal and jotted down some notes on how he should word things, and the layout of his letter. He decided that he wanted to go for a decent baseline amount of flattery but stick mostly to just facts. He also decided that offering his services in whatever capacity the Duke might need wouldn't be a bad idea. It took him a little while, but when he finished, he found that the butler, Garen wasn't it, was waiting just outside the door with a tray containing a few things. One was another hot cup of tea for him. Aside from that was a small oil lamp, something that looked like a crude matchstick, a stick of something green in color, a small piece of ribbon, and finally what looked like an ornate Hanko name seal. Sensing his confusion, the butler asked if he was finished with his letter. When Ryuji said he was, the man handed him the cup of tea and took the letter from him. He then used what apparently was a match to light the lamp. The stick turned out to be wax that he began heating up. After rolling the letter up, he deftly wrapped it in the strip of ribbon, leaving a bit as a sort of tassel. He then dripped the hot wax onto the ribbon and pressed the seal gently over the wax. Ryuji realized he was staring slack-jawed and quickly composed himself, pretending that he had been drinking his tea before the butler turned around. He suspected that the butler had seen his expression anyway, but he was too professional to let that color his expression as he spoke. I shall personally deliver your response to the Duke. Are you expecting a reply in return? Ryuji shook his head slightly, and the butler left briskly. Ryuji studied the characters on the seal and figured out that it said Office of Tax Collection. After leaving the small room, Ryuji spotted Aline still sitting at her desk and sat opposite her. He thanked her for her help in the matter and took the stack of papers and slid them inside his satchel. When he straightened up, he pulled out his coin pouch and fished out 6 small gold and laid them on the desk. As he spoke, he slid them across to Aline. I believe your fee is a small gold per land or tax title you handle? Aline's eyes went wide. Obviously, he knew that her fee was to be waived if it was a direct order from the Duke, but here he was paying her the full amount anyway. She was about to protest, but he just smiled at her and quickly got to his feet and cut her off. Ryuji thanked Aline again and she waved him off with the beginnings of tears in her eyes and a lame remark that it was a pleasure working with his most gracious lordship. Ryuji left the tax office uncomfortably with a stiff smile on his face. Only when he got back outside did he remember that all the cats were waiting for him. He quickly called them all over and they all eagerly got up, rushed to him when they spotted him. There has been a change of plans. I need you all to come with me though. Before we handle business, let's get some food. Ryuji was beaming as he walked over to the plaza. The adult beast folk all looked a little reluctant about accepting his generosity, but the children were skipping and running in glee. Apparently, the words meat skewer were some kind of magic to them. He went to the stand that the young dog beast folk was running and the boy thanked him profusely. The cats all looked confused at first, but realization dawned on them when he spoke to the boy. It's good to see you feeling better. I guess the priest got you healed up without a problem, that's good. Give me 20 skewers. That's all I intend to charge you for the next 8 days. Be sure to let your brother know too, so he doesn't feel like I'm expecting him to bring me money or something. As the boy began passing out the skewers to the hungry cats, Ryuji made his way over to Lisbeth, who was also ecstatic to see him, and began telling him all about how the renovations to the bakery were going. She was so engrossed in the conversation that she didn't even realize that Ryuji had slipped the 2 meat skewers into the buns as he ate them. He was asking about the prospects for hiring help when the cats came walking up licking their lips. He then ordered sweet bread for them, but Lisbeth wouldn't let him pay her. The cats all began to understand the scope of his business dealings by this time and were suddenly starting to look proud as they walked behind him. As the group of 9 walked around the set of buildings, they spotted a larger group of people in the center of the cluster of buildings. As they walked up, one young man could be heard above the murmurs from the rest of the group. I know you are all anxious. I would be lying if I said I wasn't, but I'm just asking you all to give me a couple days to figure things out, alright? The murmurs grew louder until one older woman stepped forward to ask her question of the man directly. Is it true what the rumors are saying? Is Mr. Markiel the one responsible for the murders of all of those young women? How are we supposed to keep working here if everybody thinks our store is associated with a murderer, huh? Just tell me that it's not true, please. As the stricken manager tried in vain to form a reply, Ryuji stepped around the crowd and turned to face them with a serious but friendly look on his face. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's very true that Mr. Markiel was indeed the killer in question. I know because I was the one who caught him, and as proof, I have here a notice from the Duke to take possession of his family's holdings. I know that you don't know me, but I make the same request of you that he did. Give me a few days to get things sorted out. I have no intention of running anybody off, and I will try to make working here worth your time and trust. Ryuji was about to go on, but the man from before tapped on his shoulder and motioned for him to step a bit out of earshot. The young man looked to be in his early 20s, with lightly tanned skin and short messy, flaxen hair. He was dressed in a fairly nice set of clothes, with a muscular frame. When the two were a few steps away from the crowd, the young man leaned over to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. The man whispered to make doubly sure they weren't overheard and glanced behind them. Ryuji realized the beast folk were still following after him. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Varan, and I'm the store manager of the Markiel Holdings General Goods Store. I promise to work for you as long as you'll have me, but it might be a harder sell for a lot of the other workers. Aside from the fact that a lot of them watched the young Mr. Markiel grow up, there is a bigger issue. I hate to bring this up when you only just took over the business, but today marks the end of the 8-day pay period. The boss was supposed to show up today and pay everyone. To make matters worse, he was gone last pay period and I wasn't able to find enough money to pay everyone and keep the business running. All of them are already a half 8 days short on their pay. I'm actually 2 full 8 days short, but I'm not as worried about that as I am everyone else's pay. Ryuji clapped the man on the shoulder and grinned, then answered in a voice that would carry a bit. Just tell me how much everyone is owed. I'll cover everyone's pay. There were sighs of relief, but most of the crowd still looked doubtful. The manager, Varan, looked especially distressed. Ryuji understood that after that declaration that he would have to come through no matter the cost or his newly acquired workers would all leave or worse. Fortunately, money was one area where he wouldn't have to worry, but that didn't keep Varan from doing so. Sir, everyone's combined pay for the whole company comes to almost 2 small gold every 8 days. Varan had gotten progressively quieter the closer he came to saying that sum. Ryuji could sympathize with him. To the average citizens, a small gold was a veritable fortune. Which was all the more reason they were all so astonished when he didn't hesitate to pull out 4 small gold coins and hand them to the young man before turning to address them all. There, now your pay is covered. I need to talk to your manager for a bit, but when I'm done, he can go over to the money changer and get the funds split up to pay everyone. Ryuji looked back at the stunned Varan and continued in the same boisterous voice as he drew 2 more small gold and handed them over to him. This is to pay everyone that wants to stay here a signing bonus. If they are willing to stay with me, then I will be sure to treat them well. If they still want to leave, give them a bonus week's worth of pay to help them until they find their next job. I won't hold any grudges. I know that none of you know the first thing about me. Ryuji began pulling the still dumbfounded manager along. I'm serious about the bonuses, but for now, I need you to tell me about the property. I only just received it this evening and know next to nothing about it. I get that it's a general store, but what are the other 5 buildings? Huh? Oh, right. Yes, you see, even though it's a general goods store, we have a lot of different types of merchandise for sale. The large building over here is the main storefront where we sell all the various items that people might need for everyday use and a lot of other small things. We even sell a decent selection of weapons for mercenaries and citizens, and we have a contract with the city guard too. That building next to it is where the furniture is made and sold. Since that tends to be too big to fit comfortably on a regular sales floor, we have a building just for that. The building to the other side of it is where we store all of the excess merchandise, till we need it in the store. The one behind it over there is the building where we store all the building materials we sell. We sell those out of the main store, but we keep them in there because they tend to be too big and heavy. Just like the furniture, those items would take up too much of the sales floor. The big 2-story building over there is where a lot of the workers live with their families. It's not the nicest place, but it was a little cheaper than a lot of the other alternatives. A lot of the workers are here from places along the warfront and had no other place to turn. The boss took advantage of their situation and would pay them just enough to live, but not nearly enough that they could move out and fend for themselves. And that's it. Ryuji was in contemplation about all the prospects for the kinds of products he could cram into this kind of business. I see. I get the idea of what the layout of the stores is, but I have to know, what do you know about the business? Do you know the products? Do you know the suppliers? Do you know the finances? I would assume that you know all of the employees, so do you know them well enough to tell me if any of them have any problems? Baran hung his head with a troubled look and Ryuji was expecting bad news. What the young man said was anything but what he expected. Unfortunately, I do know all of that and a lot more. I was the one who ran the business, not Mr. Markeel. He got the business from his father, but he never understood how businesses work and he never seemed interested in learning. He just used the business as his personal coin purse. He would come here every so often and take the money that the business had built up just as we were getting things working again. He brought the business to the brink of collapse. I heard that some of the buildings might be sold out from under us, so you may have to take care of that too. And any time he had to pay anything for the business, he would scream about it for hours. He was a terrible boss. The only upside was that he would often leave for several 8 days on end. When he did that, I was able to get the business running again and would stash a little bit of money for keeping it running once the boss came back. Unfortunately, this last time he came back before I could stash any of the money, and he took all of it. I wasn't sure how I was going to keep the business running this time. I told everyone that the boss was supposed to be back today to pay them, but I never actually thought he would show up, or if he did, he wouldn't have any money with him. I was just hoping that I could sell off some of our stock in bulk or something to get everyone paid at least one more time. Then you show up and... The guy looked down at the hand full of gold, with tears in his eyes. Ryuji looked around awkwardly and then spotted one building the man hadn't mentioned. He walked over to it and noticed that it was another storefront, but there didn't appear to be anything in it. Hey, what about this one? Baran walked over with a sniff. Yeah, I forgot to mention this one. We don't use it at all. The former owner had some kind of plans for it, but he died before that ever happened. The young Mr. Markeel never liked the idea of spending money to fix it, so it sat up and got worse. He certainly wasn't going to do any of the work himself, and now we have this. Ryuji turned to the cats and looked pointedly at them. This will be your new store. I know that you are going to have to fix it up a lot first, but don't cut corners. I'll pay for the renovations, so just get the job done right. Fortunately, it sounds like we'll already have the construction materials on hand. Hire some craftsmen to fix the place up and then move in. This guy is going to be your manager, but for the most part, I'm going to be expecting you to keep your own store." He handed 4 small gold to Gato and turned to face Varan again. "If they need anything, I expect you'll be able to help them out. I really don't plan to be by very often either. I'll probably just come by once every 8 days to check on the books. I think that you should be just fine running the place like you have till now with one exception. I will pick up some of the money, but not too much. For now, I think I'll give it a couple 8 days to build up without collecting. Actually, if the old owner was that hard on the business, I suppose I need to give you a little more to build the business up with." Ryuji turned and started walking off. He pulled a couple more gold out of his considerably lighter coin pouch and handed them to the young man. "Now then, why don't you show me the sales floor and then the books? I want to really get a feel for what I have to work with here." As the other two left, Gato and his family were left staring dumbfoundedly at 4 gold and a building. The building was old and weathered, and it had been sitting up abandoned for who knows how long. It was also sitting on the edge of the river, so they could smell the sewer and the mold. There was a mountain of things wrong with the place, but on the other hand, as they all stared, the realization hit them. This place was absolutely enormous. There was a lot of work to be done to the place, but they would be able to handle it any way they wanted, because there was one thing that made this place better than anywhere else in the city: it was theirs. Gato and his family had their own storefront. Noguchi Ryuji thought of himself as a normal high school student in most respects. He wasn't at the top of the class in grades, but he wasn't close to the bottom either. He wasn't the most athletic boy in his grade, but he did his best and thought of himself as pretty good when it came to soccer. He didn't have a girlfriend, but he was friends with as many girls as guys. In almost every respect, he was fairly average, and there was nothing really different about him. That all changed in one night. On that night, he and all of his soccer teammates were having an in-school exhibition match between themselves, the B team, and the A team to decide who would represent their school. After losing the match, they were headed home. That's when everything changed. Noguchi Ryuji died that night, saving a teammate from being hit by a car. He met a Yuma in a small office, who told him he would be reincarnated in a new world with a choice of special ability. Between the epic weapon, epic magic, or epic finances, he chose the third and received a coin pouch that would never run out of money, couldn't be stolen, and had extra charisma to use it to the fullest. Then he was dropped at the edge of a forest near a large walled city. He almost lost his second life moments after it started when he was attacked by a werewolf and had to run for his life. After entering the city, he decided to try his hand at adventuring and went to sign up with the Mercenaries Guild. There he found he had no talent for any weapons, but also that he was genuine nobility. A gold and silver pendant on his neck had all of his personal info in the form of school registration forms and the like stored as magic images in it. Fortunately, nobody but he could read any of it, and they all assumed that it must have been hit by magic at some point and damaged. After failing to enter the Mercenaries Guild, he made his way to a magic shop and used his knowledge of minerals to impress the wizard there into giving him an apprenticeship. He also began cultivating a relationship with the serving girl at the inn he was staying at. A beautiful human girl named Karen. He, however, was not reincarnated as a human, but as a tall, handsome sun elf. His appointment as the wizard's apprentice sparked a lot of disbelief, because the old dwarven wizard had refused every applicant for apprenticeship for 50 years. It also sparked jealousy and curiosity from a certain dark elf who had been trying for 3 years to get an apprenticeship. Miyako, the dark elf, decided that she would find the sun elf and get him to give her pointers on getting an apprenticeship. The problem was that instead of waiting at the wizard's shop to catch him, she tried to find him in the city and kept missing her chance. After a couple days of living in the city, Ryuji got the chance to go on a date with Karen, and the first stop was going to the money changer, a predecessor to banks. He had a huge pile of copper coins, because that's all he could pull out of his coin purse was a single copper coin at a time but without end. While changing in the pile of copper, he began making plans to legitimize his apparent wealth. He would invest in several small struggling businesses and build them up to launder money through. Over the next few days, he set his plan in motion and began investing in small street stalls and gave them all really low interest rates. They were obviously suspicious, but he had them write out the contracts claiming that it was a way for him to not be able to cheat them. In truth, he couldn't read or write the local language yet. He then set in motion a plan to build a couple of the businesses up even more by buying them storefronts instead of lean-tos. The first was a bakery. It went fairly smoothly, and he was going to do the same with a leatherworking shop but got mixed up in a mess. A killer was on the loose in the city, and Ryuji was the only one with the knowledge and skills to catch him. Drawing on knowledge gained from his love of detective shows, Ryuji was able to gain clues at the scene of the latest murder. He then used that knowledge to question the suspect and marked him as the killer. Using body language and tells, he managed to find out where to get all the rest of the evidence needed. He then demonstrated the fingerprinting method for the first time ever to the astonished town guard and proved the killer's guilt. This and other feats of his earned the attention of the Duke of Liril, the walled city he was in. The Duke awarded him all of the family assets of the merchant who turned out to be the killer. In total, he had gained 6 buildings for solving the crimes of the merchant. One of those buildings was unused and a bit dilapidated but rather large, and that was where he settled a certain family of leatherworking cat beast folk. Only after staring dumbfounded for a few minutes did Gato and his family tear their eyes away from the huge old building that would be their new home and their new storefront. They realized that their young elf lord had walked off with the manager of the 6-building business. They hurried over to where the two were discussing the direction that the place should take. Ryuji stared around him at the 6 buildings of his new holding as a noble of the city. Anybody with enough money would be able to purchase a license and purchase a plot of land in the city, but they would never actually own that land. Nobility was different. They could purchase a property and would actually receive the deed or title to the property, and though Ryuji was a bit unsure of the details, he suspected they wouldn't even have to pay taxes on the land. It might also be that he would collect the taxes, but only have to submit a certain percentage of them. Either way was fine with him, because money was the one area that he would not have to worry about anymore. As he was contemplating, he stared at the back of the large U-shaped general store. He estimated that it would need a bit of renovation due to a lack of upkeep, but it was in use often enough, and the people who worked there kept it well enough that it wouldn't be too bad. The storage building to the right of it was in even better shape, and since there were some food items stored there were a lot of measures made to keep vermin out too. He looked to the left and the furniture shop caught his attention. This building looked to be in way worse condition than the others, because of it being on the bank of the river. He could see several places where there was mold along the bottom edge of the building, and it looked like it might be leaning just slightly. As he was assessing the furniture shop, he spotted the cats walking up to them as a group, and that brought his attention to the other waterfront building behind them. The building that he was going to move the family of 9 cat beast folk into was a bit smaller than the furniture shop, but not by a lot. Both of them were 1-story buildings but with space in the attic that could be used for storage or living space depending on how the family decided to set it up. The problem was that the building was in worse shape than the others and was very obviously leaning. Ryuji considered the possibility of the place collapsing, but that didn't seem very likely because the largest part of the building was made of stone that looked like it had been melted together. He had discovered that the reason for that look was an earth elemental spell used to meld the stone together and make it stronger. That being the case, it was this part of the building that was acting as support for the wooden portions that looked decidedly less stable. The young manager, Varan, was looking at his new employer with a trace of curiosity. To him, this was a blessing sent by the gods. Only a few minutes ago, he was wondering how long he could keep the business running and how long he could keep the people here paid, and now he had a handful of gold coins. The new owner was looking at the buildings, and there was a degree of calculation in his eyes that the old owner who died would have been hard-pressed to match. This young elf lord, for what else could he be if the Duke gave him the property, was looking at the business, and one could see that change was coming in a big way. Suddenly, he stopped staring between the cat beast folk and the abandoned building and looked directly at Varan. "Do any of the people in the business know how to do carpentry? I noticed that a lot of the buildings need some woodwork done, and if we don't have carpenters on staff, we'll need to hire them for renovating the place." As Ryuji finished, He realized that Baran was staring at him in confusion and tried saying the word renovate only to discover that he was saying it in Japanese, a sure sign that the word didn't exist in this world. He spent a moment explaining the concept without using the word again before they continued the conversation. Baran confirmed that they didn't have a carpenter employed who worked on buildings, just furniture. After we finish making the place look better and make it better to live in, I'll be hiring at least one of the carpenters who did the work to keep the buildings in good repair. I'll want you to assign people to watch the carpenters and decide who it should be. I also understood from our conversation earlier that the pay was too low. Begin assessing the business and its ability to make money. Figure out how much it can make if there isn't a constant drain on the funds that it depends on to keep going, and see if there is room in the budget to increase pay in the future. I don't want my workers impoverished and miserable. I want to pay them what their labor is worth so they are happy with their job and their performance will improve as a result. Ryuji turned and strode towards the back entrance of the storefront. For now, I need you to show me what all is sold here and where and at what prices, etc. I will look over the books after that, before I leave for the day. As the pair walked in, the slight murmur in the building died instantly, and all eyes were glued to Ryuji. He suddenly felt very awkward, realizing that all these people were looking at him with awe in their eyes. He shook it off and smirked to himself, thinking that he wasn't doing too bad for a high school kid from another world, then lightly scolded them. If you have time to gossip, you should be working. I'll make sure that you are all taken care of, but I expect you to work while you're at work. Hearing these calm, quiet words, the various people in the store got a smile on their faces and went back to work with a bit more vigor. There was something else in all their expressions that hadn't been there in a long time: hope. That tiny bit of hope was able to get them more motivated than they had felt in a long time. Baran showed Ryuji around the store and showed him an assortment of different wares for every part of life. Most of the things they had were less specialized than other stores, but much like a supermarket, they had some of most things. In the center of the store was a large section devoted to foods used in cooking. There were items like butter and crates of eggs, as well as crates of various grains sitting open with scoops in them and stacks of jute bags beside them. There were jars with crude labels and the more exotic spices in somewhat clear glass jars. This area also had some cookware, such as pans and pots, but also there were signs painted in the image of other things. One of these signs was a cast iron stove with a price painted at the bottom. Baran explained that a lot of the larger items, like the stoves of various sizes, were locked up in the storage building. Partly that was to save space, but also those things were more costly and the storage building was safer with no windows and only a securely locked door to enter it. The counter was to the rear of the groceries with medicines in glass jars and vials, next to a small section of jewelry. In front of the counter were a few types of wooden or cloth toys, and there were people bustling about everywhere. They moved to the side where the furs and clothing were. This area was in front of the area with the linens, bolts of fabric, and dyes. At the back of that was a small area in the back of the right side wing of the building. This area had a counter and a clerk who was dealing with a customer. There were signs proclaiming different types of furniture for sale, and there were several catalog-looking books with parchment pages on the counter. The customer and clerk were perched over one of these open on the counter. Baran explained that the furniture shop didn't have a dedicated storefront, but the items were instead usually made to order. The customer would come in and look for a certain type of furniture, and they would look at drawings of the pieces for sale and choose between those. Any special additions to the furniture could be made at that point for a fee. Then the order was taken out to the shop, where the carpenters would work on it and prepare it for delivery or pickup. When Ryuji inquired about that, he was told that the store owned a wagon and a pair of horses at the stables. He was also informed that the stable hadn't been paid in months. Ryuji had to facepalm at this point and asked the obviously leading question. How much do we owe them? Also, how much do we owe to various other places? I'll need a list of accounts that need settling. After apologizing for having to bring up the need for yet more money, the young manager took the new owner through the rest of the store. The other side of the store had a lot of tools, farming items, and grains, and at the back, it had a sign with pictures of the various building materials and their prices listed on it. The sign was a bit faded and most of the items were hard to make out because they were poorly drawn, to begin with. Ryuji made a note to hire an artist to come in and paint the signs and catalogs better as well as add the word for each item under the picture. Who knows, maybe his store would contribute to literacy. After the tour of the store, Ryuji was taken into the office behind the counter of the general store and shown the books for the store. It was a bit of a headache always calculating in base 8 because the people of this land, and as far as he knew every other country, all counted by 8s. This peculiar numbering system was brought about by the beast folk who introduced math to the people of the country. Many races of beast folk were born with 3 fingers and a thumb on each hand. Ryuji wasn't going to try to disrupt this in favor of the decimal system at this point in time. As he was looking over the books, Ryuji noticed a sudden and drastic decline in the business about 12 years back. When questioned, Varan confirmed that that was the point when the old owner died and the younger Markiel had taken over the business. Then he noticed some 2 years later that the business took another dive and he asked about that. Varan looked a tad uncomfortable as he explained that it was the point where the store stopped lending credit. He began trying to explain the need for the credit and barter that was done before, but it wasn't needed. You see, the farmers usually only get 1 harvest a year and a lot of our profits. Varan trailed off at the look of disgust on Ryuji's face and his heart sank. He had hoped to get the credit system or at least the bartering system back, but the young elf lord looked really mad right now and he wasn't sure it was a good idea to continue. Then Ryuji turned to him and asked, in a quiet voice tinted with outrage. That bastard cut the farmers and trappers off cold, didn't he? Did he not learn a single thing from his father or any of the people here? Let people know that we'll begin extending credit again effective immediately. Also, begin letting people barter and give them more value than their items are worth. We'll run things that way for at least a few months to get people coming back to the store that were lost due to the last owner. Varan just about fell out of his chair at the words he was hearing. The new owner wasn't mad at him, he was pissed off at the last owner. Thinking back on it, the only time the young Mr. Markiel ever looked over the books was when he didn't get as much money as he wanted from the business. Varan was sure things were finally looking up. As Ryuji left, a smile spread across Varan's face. After leaving the office, Ryuji headed for the dilapidated building near the river while Varan sprinted off towards the money changer. As they parted, Ryuji told him that he preferred to work with a lad named Shone and Varan nodded assent. A moment later and Ryuji was standing next to the building while all the cats muttered about the best way to fix the building. Ryuji walked up behind one of the men and asked about the condition of the building. How does it look? Are you going to be able to use it while it's being repaired? I don't know anything about the place, but it looks pretty bad from the outside. The well-muscled, broad-shouldered, gray tiger-striped cat beast folk turned and saluted him with a strange crossed-arm gesture before looking back at the building in the fading evening light with a bit of a grin on his face. I'm not a carpenter, but I can smell the rot and decay of the building. It's certainly going to take a bit to get it fully restored, but there are parts in the back that are clean and dry like it was never used. We will be able to live comfortably in those parts while the repairs are ongoing, and there is far more space in just those few rooms than in the family house. We'll start moving stuff in right away, if that's all right with you, my lord. Ryuji just nodded with a grin and walked off towards the river bridge and his inn. He could remember seeing others make the same gesture before, but he had never realized that it was a salute. He walked around the front of the building and looked at the state of the wooden portion of the building. It was really bad. He decided to take a quick peek inside and walked through the barely standing wooden doors. After a near miss where he stepped on a part of the floor that started to give under his foot, he began gingerly testing before placing his full weight on any part of the floor. The showroom floor of the building was hard to make out in the fading light, but it looked to be mostly moldy broken shelves in a fairly spacious room. As he got farther in, the floor became more reliable and before long, he could hear a low conversation ongoing in the rooms farther back. As he made his way through several rooms, it began to occur to him how big the building was. This building was easily half as big as the general store, or maybe even 2/3 as big. There was a commotion going on as he made his way into the room the cats were in. It seemed the cats were having an argument over sleeping arrangements. On one side, the tabby cat lady was insisting that one room was more than big enough for just sleeping in and the rest of the building should be used for business as would be proper for such a huge gift. On the other side was the dark gray-furred cat lady, insisting that there were enough rooms that using two for sleeping wouldn't hinder the work arrangements. As he stepped fully into the room, the argument stopped and all eyes, even the children, looked at him. Both women looked a little sheepish at having been caught in a catfight but got over it quickly and joined the others in a similar salute as the others in the room. After the brief pause for the salute, the old cat beast folk from the market, Gato, walked up and asked Ryuji for his opinion. "My lord, we are ever so appreciative for your help. This building is absolutely splendid, even with the work that needs to be done to it. As I am sure you heard, we were just a bit overwhelmed by the enormity of this blessing and we were unsure of your intentions about our sleeping and working arrangements in the building." Once again, the children were the most honest as one spoke in a quiet whine about how much it stinks though. Ryuji smiled at the little girl before speaking. "This is to be your new home as well as your new shop. I didn't intend to tell you how to do things, but I suppose a bit of guidance wouldn't hurt. You have enough space that you can spread out into more than one room to sleep in. Eventually, you will probably want to get a bit of furniture, but that can probably wait for now. Next, find the rooms that are the cleanest to live in and work in. Set up a full-time shop making the leather goods in that shop space. That way you won't have to put up the leatherworking to go to sleep. Once you have the rooms you intend to use picked out, then you can begin work on the rest of the place. I don't expect you to do the work on this building yourselves. I gave you the money to hire people to come here and fix the building for you. If you know people who do the work, that's fine, but you will need to talk to the boss of the crew, not the workers themselves. You can talk to Baran, the manager here, about introductions and also about building supplies. If you don't think that you can arrange all of it yourselves, then you can go to the tax office and talk to the tax collector. She's very nice. Her name is Aline. She arranged the work crew that is fixing the bakery for me right now. She may or may not have more work crews available, but you would have to go ask her. Remember, whatever happens, you are respectable business people who work for me. You're going to have to be courageous because you will need to do a lot of new things from now on, but I believe in you." After saying his speech, Ryuji left the cats, who were deep in thought. He knew it was a lot to ask of them, but they needed to grow out of their broken-down mindset. He began wandering through the rest of the building and found it was quite a large space. There were about a dozen rooms of various sizes, but most were too moldy and damaged to be usable. There was also a well in one of the rooms and a privy. That got him wondering if the sewers emptied right into the river. He was still puzzling over that thought as he made his way from the building and began heading back to the Sleeping Tree Inn, where he had been sleeping for the last 8 days. At the inn, there was a huge commotion as the owner and the patrons had found out he was responsible for catching the killer that had been haunting the city. Everyone seemed ready to buy him an ale, but the owner, Teresa, wasn't about to let anyone pay for his ale, insisting that he would drink free any time he wanted. There was somebody else who was more eager than the rest to see him. Karen was waiting outside the door to the kitchen, waiting to hear word of his return all evening. She and Teresa had received word about Ryuji's exploits of the previous day around the end of lunch and had been waiting all evening to be filled in on the details. Karen brought out a tray of bread and a serving tray full of mugs of ale and set it in the middle of the table. Teresa followed close after with 2 loaded trays of mugs and set them in the middle of the gathering crowd. Once they were both settled, Ryuji began explaining what had happened. People were listening so intently that they were hardly even drinking their ale. When it got to the part about the fingerprint dust, Ryuji said that he made a special potion and didn't elaborate on the details. He also didn't bother telling anybody any of the details of the questioning, and most of the people around him seemed to get knowing grins on their faces, probably assuming that torture was used and that he didn't want to tell his girl that he had tortured the info out of the bastard. When he got to the part about the letter from the Duke, he brought out the original letter for everyone to see. As he finished telling how he set the family of cat beast folk up with a storefront, there were mixed reactions ranging from cheering to grumblings of unfairness to outright disgust about helping beast folk. Ryuji was reminded of the odd discrimination that people seemed to have towards beast folk, and he told himself that there was only so much he could do. For now, he had helped one family and would have them interacting with people as merchants, and that was a step in the right direction. At the end of his tale, Karen had a strange look on her face. After a moment, Ryuji realized it was a look of worry, and he asked her if she was all right. "You got all that property from the Duke, so I guess you won't be staying here anymore, will you? I mean, why would you stay here in the first place, when you have this much money?" Once she had voiced her concern, Ryuji could tell that she was on the verge of bursting into tears but was holding it back. He quickly formulated his reply and put on his most charming smile as he replied to her worries. "I guess it might look like that at first, but I actually didn't get an estate or home, just the business. It had 6 buildings, and while one of them is a set of apartments, it's already full of my employees and their families, and I certainly won't be kicking anyone out of their home just to save a bit on lodging. Besides, even if I do get a home somewhere else, I would still want to come here and take meals." Ryuji was going to let that hang for a moment, not mentioning his relationship with Karen until she was about to say something. His plan fell through when Karen was getting tense to reply and noticed he was baiting her. Her reply came in the form of a light thump on the end of one of his pointy ears, and the word jerk breathed lightly into his ear. It was effective. Ryuji hadn't realized how sensitive the tips of his ears were. Everybody laughed as he gingerly rubbed his offended ear with tears in the corner of his eye. That night, his mug never ran out, and there were bards who showed up from out of town. When they heard that he had caught a murderer red-handed, they insisted on hearing the tale. After he had told them roughly the same thing, he told the rest he was feeling very tipsy and more than a little lightheaded. He told everyone that he needed to go to bed and went to stand up and promptly fell back in his chair. After everybody had a good laugh, he felt a strong pair of hands helping him up. Looking up, he found the owner of those hands was Karen, and she helped him to his room. He had an idea and stumbled his way up the stairs with her help, and eventually, he made it to his room. When he got there, he flopped back onto his bed and just lay there, not wanting to move. As he suspected, Karen began pulling his boots off and pushing his legs up onto the bed. He lay there for a few moments with his eyes closed, before cracking his eyelids to peek just in time to see Karen leaning in to kiss him. She didn't go for a peck on the cheek either, she gingerly stuck the tip of her tongue into his parted lips, and when he didn't resist, she moved into a full French kiss. She kept the kiss going for a couple seconds, and Ryuji got a bit bold. He reached his hand up to caress her face in the midst of her messy golden blonde hair, and she flinched and seemed like she was about to pull away but didn't. After several more seconds of kissing, she did finally pull away and stood there looking down at him with her beautiful black eyes. He pretended to be asleep because he wasn't sure if he should try to do anything with this girl. It had only been 9 days, and besides, she might be drunk, and Ryuji definitely didn't want to take advantage of a drunk girl. Karen smiled down at him for a couple more seconds with an almost sad look on her face before putting out the lantern and closing the door behind her. As soon as he heard her steps descending the staircase, he sat up in bed. He gingerly brought his fingers to his lips and pondered the sensation of Karen's lips and tongue. This was his first kiss, or perhaps third, since it seemed that Karen had a habit of kissing him when he was too drunk to remember it. He had kissed his mom before, and he had a younger cousin who kissed him when she was 4 and he was 8, then she declared that she would marry him when they were grown. None of that was the same as this. This was a real kiss from a girl who knew what it meant. Ryuji sat there thinking about several things for a while longer before he drifted off to sleep, still sitting up. Ryuji once again awoke with a huge hangover in the form of a splitting headache, an aversion to the sunlight, a severely queasy feeling, and a horrid taste in his mouth. He washed up with a hand towel and water in a basin that he got from the bucket near the privy. He had a new set of clothes waiting for him this morning. This was the 4th set of clothing he now owned, and the 3rd set to be delivered from the tailor shop. This was a sharp-looking ensemble in a dark tan color with cream-colored pants to complement it. When Ryuji went down to get something for breakfast, he found Karen was wearing her cream-colored dress that he had bought her the same day he bought his new clothing. She now had 3 dresses of roughly the same make. One was light green, one was a medium dark blue, and the last was the cream-colored one she was wearing today. On the same day, Teresa gave her a few of her old gowns and dresses that would fit her or could be taken in to fit her. Karen, however, only seemed to wear the 3 dresses that Ryuji bought for her. He noticed that Karen was blushing but pretended not to notice. After all, he was supposed to be asleep at the time she kissed him so passionately. She sat down across from him at the table with a bowl of some kind of porridge and a couple sweet loaves of bread. The bread seemed to have been delivered this morning, courtesy of Lisbeth, the old woman that he had bought a bakery for. Ryuji grabbed a couple of the buttery loaves and left a large copper against protest from Teresa. He had eaten light because he intended to have a second breakfast later. After finishing breakfast, he said his goodbyes at the inn and headed towards his apprenticeship at the shop of the old dwarven wizard. Leaving the inn, it was a short walk to the end of the street, then left onto the main road through the city. After an equally short walk, he made it to the Mercenaries' Guildhall in the center of the city. This building was the largest and oldest in the entire city, actually predating the city by nearly a century. At one time it had been an old fort and monastery next to the river. After passing the guild, he had to cross the bridge over the Liro River. The town was named after that river, which was in turn named after an elven goddess of the river that was said to have fallen in love with the first lord of the city, but Ryuji suspected that that was just a fable. He couldn't completely discount it, however, since this was a world with real working magic. The gods might be just as present as magic. After strolling through a plaza full of small lean-to-style stands full of various goods, he spotted his destination. The shop he was heading for was named Potions and Such, and it was run by the gruff old wizard, Dorn Firefist. The reason Ryuji was headed for this shop was because he was apprenticing to be a wizard from the old dwarf wizard who owned the shop. He was surprised to find out that the knowledge of different minerals and rocks gained in geology class was enough to get him the first apprenticeship the old wizard had ever given in his 50-plus-year career. The old dwarf was surprised by that too, but even more so by his appetite for bacon and other meats, a trait not shared by other sun elves, and by his remarkable uptake of the knowledge he was given access to. To Ryuji, the lessons were fun and not nearly as stressful as the memorization of facts, dates, and formulas that he was used to in high school. Not only his studies with Dorn, but all of the things he had heard as historical facts of the area from various people and any other knowledge he came across just stuck with him easily. He also had a natural charisma that he only had a fraction of in Japan, and while his appearance as a tall handsome sun elf could explain a large portion of it, there was more to it than that. He suspected that it was because he had been given extra help in that regard by the Yuma that reincarnated him here. As he reached the front door to the shop, he set aside all of his distracting thoughts and concentrated on what he would be doing today. When he checked the front door, it was locked, so he had to use the key Dorn had given him to let himself in. After entering, he relocked the door and checked the store to see if Dorn was up. He found the old dwarf snoring loudly in the bed in the rear of the store. The store was his home, much like many of the other people in town who owned a shop. Ryuji checked his forehead to see if it felt hot, but it didn't feel hot to him. Dorn had left a note on the door the previous day telling Ryuji that he was sick and wouldn't open the shop. Since the note was gone, Ryuji assumed that the old dwarf must feel a bit better. He certainly didn't want to push his master to do lessons if he wasn't feeling well, but since it seemed like he was okay, Ryuji got started on some breakfast. Both of them were fans of a full breakfast, and it was something they could bond over before starting the day. Ryuji wiped down the cast iron skillet and set it atop the magic oven. He then reached into the space under the oven and concentrated on the feeling of his mana flowing through him. He let a trickle of mana out and looked at the oven. The flame in the middle part of the oven was hovering above a glowing magic circle carved into the iron plate near the bottom, but it was too small. Ryuji tried again and let a slight trickle more mana out and was satisfied with the size of the flame this time. Ryuji went to the icebox in the corner and opened it to fetch the bacon, eggs, milk, and a couple vegetables that he wasn't sure of the names of but knew were edible. He grabbed an earthenware bowl and set about cracking the eggs into it before checking the skillet temperature. He cut the bacon into strips and laid them in the skillet to start frying. He then poured some milk into the eggs and used a wooden fork to whisk them together. Next, he pulled out his fancy dagger that he had never used and began chopping up some of the leafy vegetables. Once the bacon was crispy, he took it out and chopped it up into bits before carefully storing the bacon grease away for use in other dishes. He then quickly poured a thick layer of eggs into the still greased skillet and used a wooden spatula to tend to them a bit before flipping the whole thing over. Ryuji quickly cut a few slices off of the wheel of cheese and layered them, the bacon, and the vegetables onto half of the round disc of eggs before quickly and carefully flipping the other side over the top to make a perfect Western-style omelette. It wasn't until Ryuji was plating the omelette that he noticed that the old dwarf was watching him with rapt attention. Ryuji was going to offer the omelette to him, but Dorn spoke first. "Lad, what be that? Ye've made something that I've ne'er seen before. It looks and smells incredible, and I see ye've mastered your flow of mana to a precise measure." Ryuji spent the next few minutes explaining the making of an omelette to Dorn, who was fascinated. Coincidentally, the next omelette that Ryuji made for himself didn't turn out nearly as good and fell apart while he was trying to plate it. He was just happy that the old dwarf got to try the one that turned out perfect. It would be fair to say that the old dwarf liked it and ate the large meal very graciously, even sopping the cheese and juices off the plate with his bread. Ryuji spent the next hour engrossed in the last of his book on the apparently famous wizard, Sarandas. There were certain aspects of the story that were a bit more than suspect, but the story was overall rather interesting. The old wizard created some of the earliest learning materials for wizards to learn from. Also, he supposedly had 18 wives, and his descendants formed dozens of kingdoms. Right. After reading that, he was sure that this was written by a guy and was some kind of analog to hero stories from Japan. It didn't take him as long to finish the next book. The books became a lot easier after that. He had to stop several times to attend to customers. Apparently, Dorn wasn't the only wizard in town, but was the only one with a shop. Everyone who came in had the same shocked and contemplative looks when they saw Ryuji sitting behind the counter. By this point, he was getting a little tired of answering the same questions over and over. The looks of incredulity, and in some cases indignation, as if they thought he had lied to them when he responded, were also getting rather annoying. Ryuji had no problems finding most of the ingredients or books the customers were asking for. He had one customer who flatly refused to be waited on by him and insisted that he had to speak to Dorn. At this, Ryuji just arched an eyebrow and asked if he was sure about that. The show that followed was quite entertaining and very educational to Ryuji. When he told Dorn what the customer said, the old dwarf was in the middle of inscribing a very delicate-looking set of glyphs on some magic contraption. When Dorn turned around, he was wearing a very meaningful scowl. He told Ryuji to watch carefully and went about casting about a dozen minor spells at the belligerent former customer. The whole time he was chasing the guy around the shop, he was steadily explaining casting techniques and speed methods to Ryuji and using the hapless man as his test dummy. After the first couple of spells missed the guy by inches, he bolted for the door, but Dorn wasn't done yet. He fired off a very accurate spell that locked the front door in the guy's face. He then proceeded to fire almost a dozen near misses at the formerly obstinate fool. When he was done, he informed me that his lesson for the day was over and that he didn't want to be disturbed from his experiments again. Ryuji just bowed and said, "Yes, master." The bewildered man couldn't get out fast enough. Once the annoying customer who had thoroughly annoyed Dorn was gone, Ryuji turned to the retreating back of Dorn and asked something that had been on his mind since the first spell. "Master Dorn, a moment, please? I was just wondering, was all of that an illusion? I looked where the first spell landed, and despite the ice spike landing among the shelves, there was no damage." Dorn chuckled and complimented him on a good eye. He then went on to explain an enchantment cast over the entirety of the store and its contents. The specifics of the spell were a bit advanced, but the gist of it was that spells that hit the store were rendered back into magic to feed the enchantment, and it had to be strengthened every few days. He then told Ryuji that, for that reason, practicing his spells wouldn't hurt the store. He told him to avoid fire spells for now, because they might not hurt the store, but he wasn't included in that immunity. After that, Ryuji decided that he needed a plan to keep from having to bother Dorn. He could tell that the old dwarf wasn't upset with him, but he still didn't want to have to bother him again. He quickly settled on a demonstration that would stop all but the most determined of pests from causing grief. He opened the book on spell circles and spell geometry to a random page and placed it on the counter next to the book he was reading. He then went out and got a cup of dirt and placed it and a damp rag on the counter. The next 3 customers were greeted by the sight of an unfamiliar sun elf sitting behind the counter reading. Before they could ask the obvious question, he had dipped his finger into the cup on the counter and without looking drew a rough circle in the air beside him. The first guy wasn't a mage but a merchant, and this simple display was more than enough for him to realize that this was a wizard and not to be crossed. The next guy that came in was a wizard apparently. Ryuji figured that out when he made a low comment about the circle being a little unstable. His look of amazement when Ryuji flared his mana and the circle straightened was priceless. Only then did Ryuji notice him standing there. The last customer of the day was left in such disbelief of this that he asked if he could see that done again. His look of bewilderment only grew when Ryuji not only righted the next circle inside the first but also the third, and they all aligned themselves perfectly. In the end, it was the busiest day the shop had seen since Ryuji had started. The old dwarf was quite pleased with the 2 small gold and almost 3 large silver the store made that day, and when Ryuji told him how he had handled the customers' questions about his apprenticeship, he thought the old guy was going to die laughing. He was wheezing by the end. After making sure that the now jovial old dwarf was okay, Ryuji excused himself for the day. He didn't realize until he was at the vibrant green, double-swing doors leading into the old sleeping tree inn, just how hungry he was. As he ascended the stairwell in the corner of the common room, he reflected that he hadn't eaten anything for lunch. He wasn't sure what was cooking, but it smelled marvelous. When Ryuji got to his room, he doffed his belt and everything on it save for 2 items. There were 2 things he carried with him tied to the thongs of his pants and tucked into them. One was the key to his room and the other was his endless coin pouch that would have, at this point, 1 large copper in it every time he placed his fingers into it. With his necessities in place, he descended the stairs into the now familiar atmosphere of the eatery or maybe tavern that made up the base level of the inn. As soon as Karen spotted him, she grabbed a tray stacked with 2 portions of whatever the soup was tonight and headed towards where he was settling at the table. She smiled happily at him as she laid out his food and a portion next to him where she promptly settled. Even the glares from many of the patrons were tapering off as the flirtatious antics of the pair were becoming routine. They didn't have as much to talk about as the previous few days, but that didn't seem to matter much to Karen. She happily sat next to Ryuji and chatted about rude customers and how they were a problem for everyone. He had of course told her about apprenticing to the old wizard, but she didn't seem to believe him at first, so he didn't make mention of the magic shop again. He figured he would save that as a surprise visit one day. Either he would invite Dorn over to the inn for ale or he would invite Karen over to the shop to see his progress in magic studies. Soon enough, the bowls of bean, carrot, and venison stew were gone. He reflected that this was the first stew that he had tasted after arriving at the inn a little over an 8-day ago, the local equivalent of a week. Things had been really hectic over the past 10 days, but it looked as if it was finally going to calm down a bit. He still wanted to talk to and acquire a few businesses that he could then launder money through. He was certain that he would be able to use the general store to funnel a lot of his money claims through. Overall though, it looked like things were going to settle down a bit. He took his leave of Karen, but just before going upstairs, he checked to see if anyone was paying attention, and when he saw nobody looking, he brushed a quick kiss on her cheek. She flinched like she had been hit with a sudden static discharge and began turning crimson. Ryuji made his way up the stairs but stopped and winked at Karen, who was still staring at him while holding her cheek. As he left the common room, Karen let her hand drift from her cheek to her lips and remembered the passionate kiss she had given him the night before. Did he know, she wondered? Ryuji closed and locked his door and began to pull out the books from his massive satchel that he had commissioned from the old cat beast folk named Gato. There were several books in here. Once Ryuji had gotten the gist of reading the language, he took to it like a fish to a pond. He had finished the first book and read all the way through a much smaller second book and began on a third. The books in question, he opened and began taking notes from and writing them into his magic primer. He called it that, but it was also his diary, and more. He had decided he needed to write down as many things as he could remember about most of the subjects from his schooling. A lot of it would be useless, but he wouldn't know what was or wasn't until he was put in a situation where it applied. He had years of math and science knowledge stored away, as well as Japanese, literature, history, and even English studies. He decided that he would only give the last one a cursory summation since he really didn't like that course and didn't retain much. He'd honestly learned a lot more English talking to foreign exchange students than studying in class. Tonight he was going to expand the section on things he'd learned here in this world though. He already had a section set aside for the magic he was learning from Dorn. The things he was writing into his primer tonight were the spell glyphs and hand flourishes used to write them into the spell circle quicker. This was valuable information and the book was full of it if you could pull it out of the writing. He was thankful to his classical literature teacher now. Moroha-sensei was the one who had the class study the Konjaku Monogatari, a collection of very old stories from other countries. She made the class find the morals of the story and even had them find useful wisdom and identify where their cultures influenced early Japanese culture. Without her class, he doubted he would have been able to get nearly as much from this book or even be able to pick up the language as quickly. One of the biggest problems he was facing was the writing. The ink he used was pretty good, but the writing quills were a real pain. He thought to himself, not for the first time, I really need to see if I can fix these pens. The quills were apparently made from some kind of fairly common monster. He dreaded meeting the kind of creature that had quills like this, but he might have to if he was to fix this problem. He still had no idea how he would make the ballpoint though. A problem for later. After roughly an hour or candle's pan he corrected himself, he was done and ready to go to bed. After blowing out the lamp and laying on the bed, he began thinking on all the things he might bring to this world and wondered if it was right for him to contaminate their culture like that. In this way, he drifted off into a dream of Japan and an elf teaching magic at his high school. Kamagi Akira was left stunned. He was not just stunned but drowning in guilt. His best friend, Ryuji, had pushed him out of the way of a car and ended up dead because of it. As Akira lay there watching the scene in front of him, he suddenly realized something. Aimi was in love with Ryuji. He had seen her following them on occasion, but he never thought too much of it. There were plenty of girls in their high school that were a bit too shy for their own good, and seeing one that wouldn't approach guys wasn't all that rare either. Some girls were taught to fear men by their families, while others had some sort of trauma caused by men. He had mostly ignored her and figured she was that kind, but now he understood. Seeing the girl screaming and flailing, trying to get into the ambulance with the body of Akira broke down crying. Not only had he gotten his friend killed, but he had also deprived Aimi of a chance to ever go out with Ryuji. He had just been clowning around and then the car was coming at him. If only he had been paying more attention. The paramedic was helping him into a different ambulance. He had gotten a head wound from being shoved into the curb by Ryuji. His head was pounding and the paramedics said he was having trouble following the light they were shining in his eyes. They thought he might have a concussion and were taking him to the hospital. The next day, several of his friends from school showed up at the hospital. His parents had left early to go to work and he had been trying to sleep and not think about what he had seen or done. His friends all said it was just survivor's guilt and he was sure they were right, but that didn't make it hurt any less. If he had just been paying attention, his best friend wouldn't be dead and he wouldn't have heard the complete soul-rending despair of his classmate Aimi. It was only a few hours after his friends left the hospital that he was released. They said that his injuries were not severe enough to warrant the risk of staying in the hospital with the new disease going around. He didn't feel like the pain in his head was reason enough for him to stay there any longer either. Akira changed into his fresh clothing his parents brought from home and headed in that direction. It was only a few minutes' walk to his apartment anyway. Akira was walking along in a daze and apparently never saw the car that did hit him. He never even felt it. The first indication that he had that something was amiss was when he was sitting and not walking anymore. And where was he sitting anyway? As he looked around, Akira discovered it was an office or something. There were file cabinets and huge stacks of papers on a huge wooden desk after all. The walls were a neutral tan color and there was a single door into the office. The door looked normal enough, but Akira was noticing that was the last of the normalcy in the office. He jumped out of the chair and began prowling around the not-quite-normal office, if that was indeed what it was. On one wall was a latticework rack full of rolled-up maps and what looked to be magic scrolls. There was a normal office chair on the other side of the desk, but the contraption on the desk, partially hidden by the stacks of papers, looked like some steampunk amalgamation of a typewriter and a clear touchscreen computer. There were other discrepancies too, like the glowing crystals and brass settings on the wall where a regular light would be. The fan on the ceiling looked normal unless you actually looked at it. If you did, you would see that there was no motor and there were small slightly glowing lines of text on each blade, and let's not even mention that the fan was floating there while spinning and not attached to the ceiling at all. Akira marveled at that a bit. I bet that's handy if you have to switch offices. Suddenly a low, gruff, and exhausted-sounding voice replied from the door. You'd be surprised how many offices don't have the ceiling space or mana control to use it. I was quite glad when I found that this office had nothing on the ceiling actually. By this point, Akira had already looked over and was astounded at the being that was entering the office. It was a yokai. The blue-skinned yokai continued. Mind taking a seat for a couple minutes while I look at your file? I had a girl in here a bit back who had a bad reaction to what I said, and I don't want to make that mistake again. Akira took his seat in one of the two plush armchairs on this side of the desk, while the yokai took up his spot in the office chair. He had a scroll in the gold talons on his hand and was perusing it while looking occasionally at Akira with glowing solid red eyes, then finally spoke. I see. Akira was slightly unnerved by the simplicity of those two words. They could mean just about anything, and his subconscious wanted to automatically go to whatever was the worst-case scenario. His bout of anxiety about being dropped into a pool of demons or something equally terrible was relieved a moment later when the yokai spoke again, the gold horn in the center of his forehead catching the light as he looked at Akira. You are also acquainted with the other two. I will then send you to the same world where I deposited the souls of Noguchi Ryuji and Nakano Aimi. I cannot put you in the same location as either of them, but there is only one continent, sort of. If you want to meet up with them, listen for stories of their likely fame and exploits. On that note, I will now make you the same offer they had. You may choose between an epic weapon and the skill to use it, an epic spell book and the magic to use it, or an infinite coin pouch and the charisma to make use of it. Whichever you choose, the item can't be stolen from you. You will also be reborn in an adult body, but will have a long life expectancy. Make your choice quickly. Akira didn't hesitate. I'll take the magic. When he came to his senses, he was on his hands and knees in the grass. One fact came to his senses rather quickly: he had thin, dark tan hands. Next to his right hand was a very thick and rather ornate tome of some kind. One glance was enough to tell him that this was his promised spell book. Akira grabbed the spell book and sat back in the grass to peruse the contents. He looked around and found himself on the top of a hill. It was just one of many rolling hills for as far as he could see in any direction. Well, any direction, save the one with the tall mountain range looming in the distance. He thought better than to be too complacent and looked about for any obvious dangers approaching. When he was fairly certain that he was safe for the moment, he checked his person and found a dagger on his belt and a few coins in his pouch. The coins were all copper, so he figured that if the anime trope were to hold, then he was pretty much broke. He looked at the ornate tome, turning it over and over in his hands. It was bound in metals and inset with a few precious gems, just like something out of a fantasy painting or the pages of a manga. It also had a very convenient open-topped leather belt case that he would have to fasten when he had perused the contents a bit. He opened the back cover and marveled that it was even in Japanese. Listed out were every gesture and full diagrams of the magic circles, plus how to make everything he would need to cast any of the spells. This tome was truly priceless. As he was closing the tome, he noticed something in the metal of the back cover. He caught a glimpse of his face, and he was startled, to say the least. The first thing he noticed was the vibrant blue hair in a ponytail to the side. That brought his attention to the long, pointy, brown ears. He was an elf? Ryuji awoke early, to the sound of birds chirping on his windowsill. As he rolled groggily out of bed, he recalled the last traces of the nightmare he had been having. It was something about his friends dying again, and he shuddered only in part because of the early morning chill in the air. He went to the privy and got a pail of steaming hot water and a linen towel on the way out. It was rare for him to be up this early, and he figured that was the reason that he spotted another patron on their way to the privy and heard a third on their way down the stairs. It was usually deserted by the time he awoke in the morning. The other patrons of the inn paid him no mind as he made his way back to his room. He, however, looked after them with a slight bit of interest. One was a tall, thin, dark-skinned elven guy wearing some sort of thin leather vest over a pair of cloth pants and shirt in a matching rust-red color. The other one that had just gone into the privy was a tiny woman that stood only about half his height and had green shirt only a few shades darker than her hair. Ryuji wondered momentarily if this was due to a dye, a spell, or simply her natural hair color. Closing the door to his room, he left all consideration of the other patrons behind and began thinking of the day ahead. He wanted to go to the river and bathe before he went to Potions and Such, Dorn's magic shop. Accordingly, he packed all the books in the sheet of waxed parchment in the bottom of his huge satchel and topped it with his soap, towel, change of clothes, and lastly, his strange bathing cloak. Thus prepared, he dashed downstairs to the common room of the inn. At the bottom, he found the room deserted. He walked over to the counter and, hearing his approach, Karen poked her head out of the kitchen to the right of the common room. As soon as she saw Ryuji, Karen's face brightened and she rushed out, still wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning. I didn't expect to see you for a little bit. We have some yogurt, but Teresa delivered something special for you just a few minutes earlier. She said to tell you that she was sorry that it took her a couple days to make a recipe that would work with fruit in it. She found some place to get her hands on seckleberries, and she made a couple loaves of the most wonderful smelling bread with them. I don't suppose you might be interested in sharing? I'm sure they were expensive, but..." She clasped her hands behind her back and swung her top back and forth while tipping her face down and looking up at him through her long lashes. This was the single most flirtatious pose that Ryuji had ever seen outside of an anime. Ryuji thought, yeah, two can play at that, and leaned over her, getting within an inch or so before speaking in a charming but pompous-sounding voice. "I don't know. I suppose that depends what's in it for me." Then he leaned in the rest of the way and kissed her forehead. Karen flinched back as if shocked and exclaimed, "Hey!" As he was backing away, sure that he had gone too far or too fast, she surprised him even more. She threw her arms around his neck and pulled him back down into a full French kiss for a couple seconds. At first, he was tense, but then he relaxed into it and put his arms around her back as he savored the sensation. A second later, Karen backed away without letting go and looked up at him with a flushed but playful manner. "At least do it right," she breathed into his ear. And he started to lean in for another kiss. A throat clearing behind Karen made them both jump and disentangle from one another before going red in the face. Unsurprisingly, it was Teresa, wearing a huge grin on her craggy, button-nosed face. "I don't mind you two gettin' romantic, but my good elf lord, I need the services of my serving girl right now. Best you go sit back at the bar and wait for her to finish her current task, then she can take a quick break for breakfast." True to her word, Teresa let Karen go a few minutes later after what was obviously the last of the dishes being washed. Teresa pulled Karen aside while she dried her hands on the linen meant for it this time. "Listen, girl, I think you got yourself a fine fella, but you should still be careful. The whole memory thing don't sound right to me, never has. I think he's a hidin' something from us, but that's not my business. If you decide to get wrapped up in this guy's affairs, just be on the lookout for something hidden. I don't want to think that this guy's the type to dazzle with a bit of coin just to steal a night in bed, but it don't hurt to be cautious. I know you can take care of yourself, so I won't slice it thick. Just remember, politics ain't something you or me's got the skills to fight, and he's certain a noble, mark my words. Now off with you and enjoy your man, least for now if not longer. Karen wanted to refute Teresa's words, to say that she was wrong about him, but she knew that the older woman had a good eye for these kinds of things. When she looked at it from a rational point of view, she even had to agree, but she just couldn't convince her heart that Ryuji was bad for her. She knew that she had fallen hard for him, but she still couldn't convince herself that it was a tryst, that he was the type to treat her that way. As Karen came out of the kitchen with the still warm loaves of berry bread, a bowl of butter between them, and a couple mugs of mild sprout cider in her other hand, she was still thinking over Teresa's words. She sat the drinks down, and as she was settling the tray between them, she looked into his eyes. In that instant, she came to a decision. If he was leading her around in circles, she would enjoy the walk while it lasted. If it proved to be more, as she very much felt it was, she would very much like to see what life could be like with this most charming elf lord. The loaves were rather larger than either realized, or more like, they were denser than either realized. The dough that Lisbeth had come up with to hold the suckle berries was something like a bagel dough. Ryuji began thinking of the various things that this kind of dough might be good as. The berries were small and red like goji berries, but with a taste more like an apple candy. The slices of this berry bread were really good, with the butter melted on them, and were very filling. They were so filling, in fact, that there was a whole second loaf they hadn't touched, as well as a little bit of the first loaf, and they were both full. Ryuji suggested having Teresa have her fill of the bread and then serving the remainder as breakfast in the inn. This got him incredulous looks from Teresa and Karen alike. Teresa explained that the berries in the bread were rather on the expensive side owing to the difficulty of finding them. She went on to say that she thought it was a little early for them yet. Ryuji told them that was the secret of baking, they could be a little green and the baking would make them more palatable. In the end, Teresa said that she had room in the small cellar to keep the bread, and though she had the rest of the first loaf at his insistence, she wasn't willing to share the personally baked item with the rest of the customers. She said that to do so would be wrong to not just him, but to Lisbeth, who had baked this new type of bread to show gratitude to him. He left the inn and headed to the river to bathe. There were the usual assortment of people there, but unlike the last couple times, he was earlier this time and there were several people bathing at the edge of the river. He was surprised that the beast folk weren't the only ones nude, but also a number of gnomes and halflings, and even a lone elf woman. Ryuji felt quite awkward bathing in public with members of the opposite gender. He was able to reason his way past it, reminding himself that he had been to the public baths plenty of times. He further reminded himself that he used to bathe with Haruko, his older sister, and mother when he was little. Besides, he was just here to wash his hair. He had already washed his body off this morning with the basin of hot water. It was a lot harder to use the basin to wash his long hair. That was a problem he was just figuring out. In his old life, he had always had short hair, and as such, he had never had much trouble taking care of it, but here, he was a sun elf with shoulder-length blonde hair. The longer hair was harder to take care of, but the way Karen played with his hair sometimes told him she liked it. That was more than enough reason to put up with the extra care it took. These thoughts were interrupted by the giggles and splashing of children playing downstream a little. Every time he came to the river, he would bring his soap, and the children there always liked to play in the bubbles left behind. He noted with some relief that the little cat beast folk girl that he had saved from drowning before was also there with her elderly guardian, probably a grandmother. The little girl was nude like the other bathing children, but was clinging to her grandmother instead of playing in the water like she had before. The older woman was there washing her laundry, but when she noticed his gaze, she smiled and got the little girl's attention. When he was pointed out to the little girl, she brightened and came running over. She came skidding to a halt a meter from him and started playing with the end of her furry black tail nervously. Ryuji sat up, wringing the water from his hair and drying it with a towel as he sat waiting for her to say what she obviously wanted to say to him. It took the shy little girl a minute, but she finally squeezed out the words, "Thank you, sir, for saving me from the river." Ryuji reached out and patted her head and she squealed happily. Then he had the idea to try scratching behind her ears, and he was rather amazed to hear her begin purring. He noticed the grandmother watching him and smiled to her. Then before anybody started to question his morals, he tapped the girl on the head to get her out of her blissful daze and pointed to her grandmother, telling her to hurry back. The old woman only then smiled at him and got to her feet before bowing deeply. Ryuji felt a bit awkward, but he bowed back slightly and turned to leave. It was then that he noticed all the women staring at him. The gaze of a bunch of nude women unnerved him, but as he looked closer, he was relieved to see their gaze fixed mostly on his bar of soap. He then had a great idea. He waved the bar of soap in front of his face to get their attention. This left him blushing hard since he was now staring straight at several of the less reserved women in their complete nudity. However, he just held up the bar of soap and looking pointedly at them sat it down next to the top of the stairs leading down into the water. He left it on the linen he had used to wash his hair. When he straightened up, several of the women were coming his way and he decided to wave and beat a hasty retreat before they decided to thank him. He didn't think he could stand being that close to all of those nude women even if most did have a towel covering for modesty.